Welcome, welcome. You're here at Watch Harry. Today we present to you Gringotts scanned Harry at age 6 and found 73 illegal spells Dumbledore cast to control him. Like and subscribe if you want more awesome stories. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Chapter 1, The Audit. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not that Harry knew what day it was, exactly. Days at number 4, Privet Drive blurred together the way watercolors did when you used too much water, everything running into everything else, nothing staying where it was supposed to be. Tuesday meant Aunt Petunia's book club, which meant the house had to be immaculate, which meant Harry had been scrubbing the kitchen floor since 6 in the morning on his hands and knees with a brush that was missing half its bristles. He was 6 years old. He'd been doing this since he was 4. The letter didn't come through the mail slot. There was no postman, no van idling at the curb. It appeared on the kitchen counter between one breath and the next, a heavy envelope of creamy parchment, sealed with a crest Harry didn't recognize. A key, crossed with a sword, surrounded by the words Gringotts Bank, established 1474. Harry stared at it. Then he looked at the door. Aunt Petunia was in the garden, doing something aggressive to her roses. Uncle Vernon had left for work an hour ago. Dudley was upstairs watching cartoons at a volume that made the walls vibrate. Harry picked up the envelope. His name was on it. Not the boy or you or the blank space his aunt and uncle usually left where his name was supposed to go. Harry James Potter, written in ink the color of old bronze, the letters sharp and precise and absolutely certain of themselves. He opened it. The letter inside was written in the same bronze ink, and it said, in plain and slightly imperious language, that Harry James Potter, as the surviving heir of the ancient and noble house of Potter, was required to present himself at Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley, London, on Friday the 14th of September, for the purposes of a mandatory inheritance audit. Attendance was not optional. Failure to appear would result in the temporary freezing of all Potter family assets pending investigation. At the bottom, in smaller letters, transportation has been arranged. Please be prepared at the front door of your current residence at 9 o'clock in the morning on the date specified. Bring this letter. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into the waistband of his trousers, Dudley's old trousers, 3 sizes too large, and went back to scrubbing the floor. He didn't say anything to the Dursleys. This was a skill he'd developed early, the art of the strategic silence. You didn't volunteer information to people who used information against you. He'd told Aunt Petunia once, when he was 5, that he'd had a dream about a flying motorbike, and she'd gone so white and rigid that he'd thought she was having some kind of attack. Then she'd grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise and told him he was never to speak of such things again. So he'd learned. You watched, you listened, and you kept the interesting things to yourself. Friday came. Harry was at the front door at 8:55, wearing the least oversized of Dudley's cast-offs and the small backpack he used for school, which currently contained his other set of clothes, the battered copy of The Hobbit he'd found in a charity shop bin, and a peanut butter sandwich he'd made in secret at 5 in the morning. He had the letter. At precisely 9 o'clock, a crack of sound split the quiet morning air, and a figure appeared on the front path. It was short. Harry's first thought was that it was a child, but then the figure turned and Harry revised that assessment immediately and completely. It wasn't a child. It had a face that was ancient in a way that had nothing to do with wrinkles, sharp-featured, amber-eyed, with the particular stillness of something that had been patient for a very long time and had opinions about people who wasted that patience. It wore a suit of dark charcoal that fit perfectly and carried a leather satchel. Harry Potter, it said. Not a question. Yes, Harry said. I am Ragnarok, senior auditor, Gringotts Bank. The goblin, because that was what it was, Harry realized, a goblin, though how he knew this he couldn't have said, looked him over with those amber eyes in a way that felt less like being examined and more like being catalogued. You received our letter. Yes. You are prepared to come. Yes. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Ragnar's expression. Harry would later learn to recognize this as approval, though at the time it just looked like the amber eyes got slightly less sharp. "Good," the goblin said. "Come." He turned and walked down the path. Harry followed without looking back at the house. He'd expected a car. What was waiting at the curb was instead something that looked, if he tilted his head and thought about it sideways, almost like a taxi, but the proportions were wrong in ways that were hard to pin down, and the windows were tinted to near opacity, and when Ragnar opened the rear door there was considerably more interior space than the exterior should have allowed. Two other goblins were already inside, both in similar dark suits, both watching Harry with that same cataloging attention. "Sit," Ragnar said, climbing in after him. Harry sat. The door closed. The vehicle moved. He looked out the window and watched Privet Drive disappear. The journey took less time than it should have. Harry was fairly certain they were in London proper within about 20 minutes, though the route the vehicle took seemed to involve several streets he couldn't have found on any map. When they stopped and he climbed out, blinking in the thin morning sunlight, he was standing on a bustling street that shouldn't have existed. He knew it shouldn't have existed because the people on it were wrong in the best possible way: robes instead of suits, an owl sitting on someone's shoulder like it was a perfectly ordinary accessory, a boy about his age clutching what appeared to be a set of scales and arguing with what appeared to be his mother about something that involved the words cauldron quality. A woman in emerald green walked past reading a newspaper whose headline, Harry caught in a flash, read Ministry Committee debates werewolf registration ACT. He wanted to stop and look at everything. He didn't. He followed Ragnar. The bank was white marble and enormous, and the pair of goblins flanking the bronze doors watched him with the same amber-eyed intensity as Ragnar, though with considerably less warmth. Inside, the hall was all soaring ceilings and the kind of organized chaos that suggested everyone knew exactly what they were doing and was doing it very fast. Ragnar led Harry not to the main counters but to a side corridor, then another, then through a door that required the senior auditor's ring pressed to a specific stone to open. Beyond it was a room that was clearly not for regular customers. It was quieter than the main hall, for one. The walls were lined with shelves of ledgers so old the spines had lost their lettering. In the center of the room was a chair that looked like something between a throne and an examination table, high-backed, fitted with restraints that were currently folded open and away, made of some dark wood that had a faint iridescent grain when the light hit it right. On a stand beside it sat a shallow stone basin, and above the basin floated what Harry could only describe as a lens, circular, perhaps 8 inches across, made of something that wasn't quite glass and wasn't quite crystal, turning slowly in the air with no visible means of support. The other two goblins took positions at opposite ends of the room. Ragnar set his satchel on a table and extracted a ledger, a quill, and a small vial of dark ink. "Sit in the chair," Ragnar said. Harry sat. "What is this?" he asked. Not fearfully, he was genuinely curious, and fear had never been something he led with. Fear was for later, for when you had more information. "An inheritance audit," Ragnar said, making a note in the ledger, "includes a comprehensive diagnostic scan of the individual's magical core, bloodline status, and any external enchantments currently acting upon their person." He looked up. "It is standard procedure for all heirs of ancient and noble houses upon reaching their 6th year." "External enchantments," Harry said slowly. "Spells cast upon you by others," Ragnar said. "Whether you are aware of them or not." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then, "And if there are some I'm not aware of?" Ragnar looked at him again with those amber eyes. "Then we document them." "And then what?" "That," the goblin said, "depends very much on what we find." He set his quill down and turned to face Harry fully. "I want to be clear with you, Mr. Potter, before we begin. You are 6 years old, and in my experience, adults have a tendency to explain things to children in ways that protect the adults rather than inform the children. I do not operate that way. Gringotts operates on the principle that a client is entitled to complete and accurate information about their own affairs. Are we agreed? Harry stared at him. Nobody had ever spoken to him quite like this before, like he was a person, specifically, rather than an inconvenience in the rough shape of one. Yes, he said. Agreed. Good. Ragnarok returned to his preparations. The scan will take approximately 11 minutes. You will feel a sensation not unlike warmth. Do not attempt to interfere with the lens. It will not harm you. He said something then in a language Harry didn't recognize, short, guttural, rhythmic, and the floating lens tilted on its invisible axis and oriented itself toward Harry, and then the warmth came. It was nothing like pain. It was more like being underwater in the shallowest, most sunlit part of a lake, a slow, diffuse pressure that moved through him in layers, like someone very carefully turning the pages of a book. Harry sat with his hands loose in his lap and let it happen. The lens turned. The stone basin below it began to fill with light, thin threads of it rising from Harry's skin and drifting downward to pool in the stone, each thread a slightly different color, deep blue and silver and a fierce, unexpected gold and green so dark it was nearly black. The two flanking goblins were very still. Ragnarok had his quill ready. The lens turned. At the 4-minute mark, Ragnarok made his first note. At the 6-minute mark, he made several more in rapid succession, and Harry noticed his posture had changed, something had gone tight and controlled in the set of his shoulders. At the 8-minute mark, one of the other goblins said something in that same guttural language, low and sharp, and Ragnarok responded in 2 words without lifting his quill. At 11 minutes, the lens stilled. The warmth faded. The threads of light in the basin went quiet and lay there like threads of silk on still water. Ragnarok looked at the basin for a long time. Then he looked at Harry. "Mr. Potter," he said. "I am going to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully." "All right," Harry said. "The diagnostic scan has identified 73 separate enchantments currently acting upon your person." Ragnarok's voice was perfectly level. "Of those 73, all 73 are classified as illegal under Goblin Wizard Treaty law. 61 are illegal under British Wizarding Statute. And 44 of them should, by any reasonable measure of magical ethics, be impossible to cast on a child." The room was absolutely silent. Harry heard his own breathing. In and out. He looked at the basin with its colored threads, and he thought, with a strange, distant calm, "That's me in there. That's what's been done to me." And underneath the calm was something vast and complicated that he didn't have words for yet, something that would need a lot of time and space before it resolved itself into something he could name. "Who cast them?" he asked. Ragnarok opened the ledger to the page he'd been writing. He turned it so Harry could see. At the top of the page, in that bronze ink, was a list. 73 entries. Next to each one, the nature of the spell, its likely effect, and its caster's magical signature. Every single entry had the same signature. APWB Dumbledore. Harry read the name. He read it again. He knew that name, knew it the way you knew the names of people you'd never met but who were somehow always in the room anyway. Dumbledore. The headmaster of a school he'd never attended. The man who, as best Harry could piece together from the fragments of overheard conversation his aunt and uncle hadn't realized he was absorbing, had something to do with what happened to his parents. "Tell me what they do," Harry said. Ragnarok pulled the ledger back and set it on the table and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how much to say and in what order. When he spoke, his voice was careful and exact. "The first category, 17 spells, relates to your magical core. They suppress it. Limit its natural development and capacity. Without them, your core would currently register as..." He consulted the page. "Exceptional. In the top 1 percentile of recorded living wizards. With them, it registers as slightly below average for your age, which is what the scan initially showed before penetrating the suppression layers. Harry absorbed this without expression. The second category, 22 spells, relates to your perceptions and emotional responses. They dampen certain cognitive functions. Reduce curiosity. Reduce the instinct to question authority. Enhance the tendency toward compliance in high-pressure situations. Ragnarok paused. In simpler terms, they make you easier to direct. Like a puppet, Harry said. More like a compass with its needle bent, Ragnarok said. Still functional. Still capable of independent movement. But reliably oriented in a particular direction. What direction? Toward Albus Dumbledore. There it was. Harry sat with that for a moment. The warmth from the scan was completely gone now, and in its absence the room felt very cool. He looked at his own hands in his lap, small hands, with a scar on the left palm from a broken glass he'd been made to clean up bare-handed. He turned them over. The rest, he said. Ragnarok's expression did something complicated. The remaining 34 are a mixture. Memory modifications, specific memories suppressed or altered, primarily relating to accidental magic events that would have drawn attention to your capabilities. Loyalty bindings, which are exactly what they sound like. A compulsion to return to your current residence even if the opportunity to leave presents itself. A block on your ability to perform wandless magic, which you would otherwise be capable of. And, he stopped. And? Harry said. And a soul tether, Ragnarok said, very quietly. Tied to a specific magical object. We believe we know what that object is, but I want to be cautious in how I characterize it until we have consulted with our curse breakers. Soul tether. Harry didn't know what that meant exactly, but something in the word soul made the distant vast complicated feeling press closer. Is that why I lived? He asked. When my parents died. Is the tether why I survived? Ragnarok was quiet for longer than he'd been quiet before. Then, possibly. But not in the way that has been implied to you. Nothing's been implied to me, Harry said. Nobody tells me anything. No, Ragnarok said, and there was something in his voice now that was different from the precise auditor's tone. Something that had an edge to it. No, I imagine they don't. He closed the ledger. Mr. Potter, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. All right. If we removed these spells, if we cleansed your core and your mind of every one of them, do you understand that your life would change significantly? That the people who placed them would know? That there would be consequences? Harry thought about Privet Drive. He thought about the cupboard under the stairs where he slept, about the way his aunt looked at him like he was a stain she couldn't scrub out, about the way his cousin's friends thought it was funny to hold him down and cut his hair with blunt scissors. He thought about never knowing his parents' names until he was 5 and found an old photograph in a charity shop book about the history of some war, a photograph that he hadn't even been certain was them, but that made his chest do something strange when he looked at it. He thought about 73 spells. Yes, he said. I understand. And I want them removed, Harry said. They didn't do it that day. Ragnarok explained, with the same precise clarity he'd used throughout, that the removal of 73 illegally cast spells from a 6-year-old's magical core was not a procedure to be undertaken without preparation. There were curse breakers to consult. Protocols to follow. The soul tether in particular required specialist review. Also, Ragnarok said, and Harry sensed he was choosing his next words carefully, we will need to make certain legal preparations before the removal. Because once the spells are gone, the individual who cast them will become aware of their absence. And that individual is. He paused. Not someone who accepts obstacles passively. Dumbledore, Harry said. Yes. He'll try to recast them. He will try to regain control of the situation, Ragnarok said. How he does that will depend on what resources are available to him and what narrative he constructs around the removal. He is very skilled at constructing narratives. Harry filed this away. How long before we can do the removal? 2 weeks. Perhaps 3. Ragnarok looked at him. In the meantime, you will need to return to Privet Drive. Harry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I know, Ragnarok said, and the edge was back in his voice, not directed at Harry. But we cannot move you permanently until the legal framework is in place. What I can do, he reached into his satchel and withdrew a small object, setting it on the table between them. It was a flat stone, smooth and gray, roughly the size and shape of a large coin. Is give you this. It is a ward stone, keyed to your blood. As long as you carry it, Gringotts has a continuous record of your location and physical status. If you are in danger, he said the last word with the same flat precision he'd used for everything else, but his amber eyes were not flat. You press it, and we come. Harry picked up the stone. It was warm in a way that wasn't temperature. Thank you, he said. He meant it. Ragnarok looked at him for a moment with those ancient amber eyes, and then he did something Harry would think about for a long time afterward. He inclined his head. Not a bow, goblins didn't bow, Harry would learn. But a specific deliberate inclination that Ragnarok would later explain was the goblin gesture of recognition between equals. Harry, without knowing exactly why, inclined his head back. The auditor for the financial portion of the inheritance review was a younger goblin named Crickle, who had a narrow face and moved at approximately 3 times the speed of anyone else in the room. The financial audit was, in some ways, more immediately alarming than the magical one, though Harry had less context to be alarmed with. The Potter estate, Crickle explained with the clipped efficiency of someone who dealt in facts and had no patience for the feelings facts produced, was substantial. 3 vaults, not 1. The one Harry technically had access to was Vault 687, a moderate trust vault, as was standard for heirs under age. The second vault, Vault 245, was the main Potter family vault, currently in a state of limbo because nobody had properly claimed the family headship since James Potter's death. The third vault, Vault 111, was the ancient Potter vault, which had been sealed for 50 years and contained, among other things, properties, investments, and a collection of heirlooms that Crickle listed in a tone suggesting that even he, a goblin with no particular attachment to human wealth, found it mildly impressive. Who has been accessing the trust vault? Harry asked. Crickle's stylus paused. The vault has seen quarterly withdrawals since November 1981, the goblin said, pulling up a ledger. The withdrawals have been authorized by a discretionary management clause. Authorized by whom? Another pause, slightly longer. The clause was filed by Albus Dumbledore, acting in the claimed capacity of magical guardian. Claimed, Harry said. Crickle looked at him. There is no legal documentation of a formal guardianship appointment, the goblin said precisely. The clause was accepted by a junior vault manager in 1981 and was never reviewed. Another brief pause. That junior vault manager has since been dismissed for unrelated reasons. Harry looked at the quarterly withdrawal figures Crickle had laid out in the ledger. He didn't have enough context to know if the amounts were large or small in absolute terms, but he could do the math. 5 years of quarterly withdrawals, and not a canute of it had ever come to Privet Drive. Not for his clothes, not for his food, not for his schoolbooks. Where did the money go? Harry asked. Crickle produced another ledger page. The withdrawals had been routed to 3 different accounts. One appeared to be a general order of the Phoenix Operational Fund. One was a research fund at Hogwarts. The third was a personal account in the name of APWB Dumbledore. Harry looked at this for a while. I want all of it documented, he said. Every withdrawal. Every routing. All of it. That is already being done, Crickle said, and made a note. By the time Ragnarok walked Harry back to the non-customer entrance where the vehicle was waiting, it was past 2 in the afternoon. The late September sun was making a half-hearted effort through a gap in the clouds. Harry stood on the step for a moment and looked out at the edge of Diagon Alley visible from the angle, a slice of the street, people moving through it, a flash of color from a shop window, a laugh from somewhere out of sight. "Ragnarok," he said. "Yes. What happens to Dumbledore? When this is all done, I mean. When the spells are removed and the documentation is filed and the legal framework is in place. What actually happens to him?" Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "That will depend on many things. On who believes the evidence. On who has the will to act on it. On how skillfully Dumbledore manages his own narrative." He paused. "He is the chief warlock of the Wizengamot. He is the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. He has allies in every institution that has the power to hold him accountable. He will not simply." The goblin paused again, searching for the word. "Fall." "I know," Harry said. "But I'm asking what we're trying to make happen." Ragnarok looked at him with those amber eyes, and for the first time in the whole long strange day, something that might have been a smile moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. It was not a warm smile, exactly. It was the smile of someone who appreciated precision. "Accountability," Ragnarok said. "Full, documented, public accountability. For every spell. Every theft. Every decision made with your life as the raw material." He paused. "And freedom, for you. Complete and absolute and legally ironclad freedom from his interference. Forever." Harry nodded. He picked up his backpack. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Ragnarok confirmed. The vehicle was waiting. Harry got in. It pulled away from the curb, and through the tinted windows Diagon Alley slid past, bright and strange and entirely unlike anything he'd known before today, and then it was gone, replaced by ordinary London, and then by the motorway, and then by the familiar deadening sameness of Surrey. He reached into his waistband and felt the ward stone. Still warm. He spent the drive back mentally cataloguing what he knew. 73 spells. A stolen inheritance. A claimed guardianship with no legal basis. A soul tether he didn't fully understand. And on the other side of all of it, a man who was apparently brilliant and powerful and entirely accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted from situations he had engineered. Harry thought about the word compass. About having your needle bent so that north meant someone else. He thought about what a compass would do if the thing bending the needle was suddenly removed. It would find true north. He was still thinking about this when the vehicle stopped at Privet Drive and he climbed out and walked up the front path and let himself in through the back door as quietly as he always did. Aunt Petunia was in the kitchen, and she looked up and her face went through its usual sequence of expressions when it landed on him, the faint recoil, the set jaw, the deliberate return to whatever she'd been doing. "Where have you been?" she said. "Library," Harry said, which was where he always said he went when he went anywhere. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd seen 1,000 times but had never quite been able to read. There was something in it, not love, not warmth, nothing so soft as either of those. But something. Recognition, maybe. The terrible uncomfortable recognition of a person you were trying very hard not to see. "Wash up," she said. "Dinner in an hour." Harry went upstairs. He put the ward stone on the shelf in the cupboard beside the loose brick where he hid the things he didn't want found. He put the peanut butter sandwich, still uneaten, next to it. He lay down on his cot in the dark of the cupboard under the stairs and looked at the ceiling which was 2 feet from his face and thought, 2 weeks. Above him, the house creaked and settled in the way old houses do. Dudley's television blared. Uncle Vernon's car turned into the drive. The evening moved toward night, as it always did, regardless of what happened during the day. 2 weeks. Harry closed his eyes and waited. 12 days later, not 14, because Ragnarok was thorough and when he said preparations were being made, they were, the ward stone on the shelf stopped being warm and became briefly, unmistakably hot. Harry was already awake. He'd been lying there in the dark for 3 hours, too alert for sleep, running through everything he'd read and reread in the books Ragnarok had arranged to have delivered to the Gringotts branch nearest Surrey, held in a discreet collection that Harry picked up on his ostensible library visits. He'd spent 12 days learning things, about magical law, about the treaty between goblins and wizards, about the legal structure of the Wizengamot, about the specific statutes under which the spells on him were illegal. He picked up the stone. He dressed in the dark, quick and quiet, pulling on the least terrible of the Desley hand-me-downs and his trainers. He shouldered the backpack. He looked around the cupboard for a moment, the single shelf, the cot that was too short, the collection of objects he'd accumulated the way anyone accumulates things when their world is very small. He took the peanut butter sandwich. He left everything else. He let himself out the back door and down the garden path and through the gate that opened onto the alley behind the row of houses, and Ragnarok was waiting for him there in the dark, satchel over one shoulder, with 2 goblins Harry hadn't met before who had the particular bearing of people whose professional specialty was not auditing. "You're early," Harry said. "Preparations were completed ahead of schedule," Ragnarok said. "Are you ready?" Harry thought about 73 spells. He thought about bent compass needles. He thought about his parents' names on a photograph in a charity shop book. "Yes," he said. They walked out of the alley and didn't look back, and behind them Privet Drive sat in its nighttime quiet, completely unaware that the thing it had been used for 5 years had just ended. Chapter 2, the cleansing the room they'd prepared for him was deep inside Gringotts. Not the audit chamber, that had been businesslike, functional, the kind of room designed for documentation rather than anything messier. This room was different. It was carved directly into the bedrock beneath the bank, which meant the walls were raw stone that had never been smoothed or painted, and the torches set into iron brackets at intervals weren't magical approximations of fire but actual fire, burning with a low amber light that made the shadows move like living things. The air tasted of deep earth and something metallic that Harry would later learn was the residual charge of very old magic soaked into the rock over centuries. In the center of the room was a flat stone table. Not the chair from the audit room. A table, low and wide, with channels carved into its surface in patterns Harry recognized from the books Ragnarok had sent him, the same runic grammar used in the oldest goblin warding texts, the kind that predated the statute of secrecy by several hundred years. Around the table, at precise intervals, stood 7 bronze pedestals. On each one, a shallow bowl filled with something that burned without smoke, each a different color. Pale blue. Deep red. Silver so pure it hurt to look at directly. Green the color of deep water. Gold. Black. And the last one, closest to the door, the same warm amber as Ragnarok's eyes. 5 goblins Harry hadn't seen before stood at various positions around the room, and they watched him come in with the particular attention of people who had been briefed and were now verifying the briefing against reality. One of them, older than the others, with a face like a topographical map of somewhere severe and cold, looked at him for a long moment and then said something to Ragnarok in gobbledygook. "He says you're smaller than he expected," Ragnarok translated, with no particular inflection. "Tell him I get that a lot," Harry said. The old goblin blinked. Then he said something else, brief, and turned back to his preparations. "He says that's a good sign," Ragnarok said. He set his satchel on a side table and turned to face Harry. "This is a Grak. He is the most senior cursebreaker currently employed by Gringotts. He has removed complex illegal enchantment arrays before, though nothing," a brief pause, "of quite this scope. He's never done 73, Harry said. "No one has ever done 73, Ragnarok said. "On a child. On anyone." He stopped. "I want to ask you again, Harry, and I want you to think about it, not just answer, whether you understand what this will involve." Harry had thought about it for 12 days. He'd thought about it on the walk here, through the tunnels below the bank that smelled of iron and old stone. He'd thought about it every night in the cupboard, lying on his cot with the ceiling 2 feet away, turning the question over and over like a stone in a river until it was as smooth as he could make it. "It'll hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Ragnarok said simply. Removing a single complex enchantment from a magical core causes significant discomfort. Removing 73, layered and interlocked the way these are, he stopped. "We will have healers present. There is a potion sequence that will help manage the physical response. But I will not tell you it will be painless because it will not be, and I gave you my word about complete and accurate information." Harry nodded. "What do I need to do?" "Lie on the table. Remain still as long as you're able. If you can't remain still, that's all right, we've accounted for that." Something moved briefly in Ragnarok's expression. "And talk to us if something feels wrong. Not painful, painful is expected. Wrong. You'll know the difference." Harry looked at the table. The channels carved into it caught the amber firelight and held it. He crossed the room and climbed up and lay down on his back. The stone was cold through his shirt. He looked up at the ceiling of raw rock, at the veins of quartz running through it that caught the torchlight and glittered faintly. He put his hands at his sides and breathed, slow and even. Agrak moved to one end of the table and spoke something low and sustained in gobbledygook. The other 4 cursebreakers took their positions around the pedestals. Ragnarok stayed near the wall, ledger open, quill ready, the witness, Harry realized, the one making sure every detail was recorded. The amber-colored flame on the nearest pedestal flared once, and then all 7 bowls ignited simultaneously into something brighter and more complex, and the channels in the stone table began to glow. The first spell came off like a layer of skin. There was no good way to describe what it felt like. Harry tried, later, many times, and never quite managed it. The closest he got was, imagine that you've been wearing a coat your entire life, a coat you didn't know was a coat because you'd never been without it, and someone grabs the collar and pulls. The first one was disorientation, a spell from the perception dampening category, he learned afterward, one of the subtler ones that had been blurring the edges of his curiosity since before he could walk. When it came away the room got sharper. Not visually, in some other sense, some dimension of awareness he didn't have language for. Like someone had been holding a hand over his eyes and lifted it. He had approximately 3 seconds to appreciate this before the second one came off. That one was worse. The suppressions on his magical core were deeper, older, the ones Dumbledore had apparently layered in first, foundational to everything else. They didn't come away like a coat. They came away like something that had fused to the tissue, that had to be carefully, precisely separated from what it had grown into. Agrak worked with extraordinary delicacy. Harry could feel the precision of it even through the pain, the way a good surgeon's hands feel different from a bad one's even when both are cutting. But delicate or not, it hurt. Harry kept his eyes on the ceiling. He counted the veins of quartz. He breathed. By the 12th spell, he was gripping the edges of the stone table hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. By the 18th, he'd stopped being able to feel his hands entirely, which was either the healer's potions working or something more alarming. One of the healers checked his pulse and said something reassuring in gobbledygook which Ragnarok translated as normal response, continue. At the 23rd spell, one of the loyalty bindings, which Agrak left until enough of the core suppressions were cleared to give Harry's own magic room to breathe, Harry made a sound he was not proud of. Not a scream. Something lower and less controlled, dragged out of him before he could stop it, because the loyalty binding didn't feel like a coat or a fused layer. It felt like a hook. Harry. Ragnarok's voice, close. The goblin had moved to stand beside the table. I'm fine, Harry said, which was technically a lie. I know, Ragnarok said, which suggested he knew it was a lie and was choosing not to address this. Look at the ceiling. Count the quartz veins. I was already doing that. How many? Harry looked. 17 in the central section. More toward the east wall. Good. Ragnar stayed where he was. Keep counting. It was such a completely practical and unheroic thing to do that Harry almost laughed, and the almost laugh cut through the pain better than anything else had managed. He counted quartz veins. Agrak continued working. The memory modifications were their own category of terrible, not physically painful the way the core suppressions had been, but vertiginous in a way that was somehow worse. As each one came away, something shifted behind Harry's eyes. Not memories returning, exactly, more like doors opening onto rooms that had been sealed so long they'd become part of the wall. He glimpsed things at the edges. A woman's laugh. The sensation of being held. Green light, which he'd always associated with a feeling he couldn't name, and now, with the doors cracking open, could begin to. It was the last thing his mother had seen, and some fragment of it had lodged in him when the curse rebounded. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for a moment. Ragnar didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The soul tether was last. Agrak had deliberately saved it, Ragnar had explained beforehand, because the soul tether was the most complex of all of them and because the curse breakers needed to understand its full structure before they could safely remove it. They'd spent 3 of the 12 preparatory days on the soul tether alone. What it was, when fully examined, was this: a fragment of someone else's soul, dark and fractured, had been lodged against Harry's own at the moment of the killing curse's rebounding. Not in him, exactly, more adjacent, tethered to the outermost layer of his magical core like a barnacle on a hull. It had been there for 5 years. It had, in ways that the curse breakers had documented carefully and Ragnar had explained to Harry with the same precise honesty he applied to everything, been influencing him. In what way? Harry had asked, during the preparation. Dark impulses that are not your own, Ragnar had said. Moments of anger disproportionate to cause. Dreams. An instinctive pull toward certain kinds of magic. He'd paused. None of it makes you dark, Harry. You are not responsible for what was lodged in you without your knowledge. But it has been there, and removing it will change how you feel. Whose is it? Harry had asked. Ragnar had hesitated, which was unusual for him. We believe it belongs to the wizard known as Lord Voldemort. Harry had sat with that for a while. Then, Dumbledore knew it was there? The soul tether analysis suggests it was discovered approximately 18 months after your parents' deaths, Ragnar had said quietly. And left in place. Left in place. Now, lying on the table with 23 loyalty bindings and 31 core suppressions and 14 memory modifications and 4 compulsion charms already stripped away, Harry felt Agrak's attention shift to the last remaining enchantment and he thought about those words again. Left in place. Not overlooked. Not missed. Discovered, examined, and deliberately left. Because a piece of Voldemort's fractured soul lodged against Harry's was, presumably, useful to someone who wanted to use Harry as a weapon against Voldemort at the right moment. It was elegant, in the way that horrifying things sometimes were. The sacrifice, carrying the instrument of his own potential destruction inside him, pointed at the target like a compass needle at true north. Except Dumbledore had bent that needle too, for good measure. Agrak placed both hands above Harry's chest, palms down, and spoke a long sustained phrase in gobbledygook. The soul tether came away. Harry had expected this to be the worst. It wasn't. It was the strangest. There was a moment of extraordinary cold, deeper than anything physical, like having a window opened in midwinter, and through that window, just for an instant, he felt something that was not him recoil. Something old and hungry and afraid. He pushed at it, instinctively, from a place he hadn't known he had. And it went. The cold vanished. The tether was gone. What was left was just Harry. And Harry, the actual Harry, the one who'd been underneath all 73 layers of interference for his entire life, felt like the surface of a lake after a stone had been dropped through ice. Still. Clean. Impossibly, unexpectedly clear. He lay there on the cold stone table and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the other curse breakers said something in gobbledygook. A Grak responded. The exchange went back and forth for a few seconds. What are they saying? Harry asked. Ragnarok looked at him from beside the table. A Grak is saying that your core, now unobstructed, is responding the way a compressed spring responds when released. He paused. The other is asking whether we should put the containment wards up. The containment wards, Harry said. To prevent any spontaneous magical discharge from, the 7 bowls on the pedestals all went out simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, the channels carved into the stone table blazed gold, not amber, not the warm torchlight color, but a sharp, singing, absolute gold that lit the entire room from below and cast everyone's face in a light that made them look like they were standing in a sunbeam. The quartz veins in the ceiling caught it and scattered it, and the whole underground room became briefly, absurdly beautiful. Then it faded. The torches relit themselves. The stone table's channels cooled back to their ordinary carved darkness. Harry sat up. He sat up, which he had been warned not to do too quickly because of lightheadedness, and felt no lightheadedness whatsoever. He felt like someone had opened every window in a house that had been closed for years. He felt, and he would never quite say this out loud because it seemed too large and too private, like himself. For the first time in his life, entirely and completely like himself, and the relief of it was so profound it made his eyes sting. He blinked hard, once, and it was fine. Ragnarok was looking at him. The amber eyes were doing something complicated. How do you feel? The goblin asked. Harry considered this seriously, the way Ragnarok had from the beginning treated him seriously, and answered honestly. Like I took off shoes that were 2 sizes too small and I didn't know they were too small until they were off. A Grak, apparently, spoke enough English to follow this, because the topographical map face did something that on a less austere face would have been a smile. They kept him in Gringotts for 3 days after the cleansing. Medical protocol, Ragnarok said. The curse breakers and healers wanted to monitor the core stabilization, when a magical core that had been suppressed since infancy was suddenly released at full capacity. The rebalancing process required observation. Harry spent those 3 days in a set of rooms that were Spartan but private and warmer than the audit chamber, with a narrow bed that was twice the size of his cot at Privet Drive and a window that, impossibly, given how deep underground they were, somehow showed a view of the Scottish Highlands, grey and sweeping and magnificent. He suspected it was an enchanted window. He didn't ask. He liked it. During those 3 days he read, slept, ate food that a goblin attendant brought on a schedule he quickly memorized and began to look forward to, and occasionally sat cross-legged on the bed and simply existed in the novel sensation of his own mind. It was like learning to walk on a floor that wasn't tilted anymore. He kept doing things that surprised him, picking up a book on advanced magical theory that had been left in a stack by Ragnarok and understanding it not just at the surface level but in the deep structural way, the way you understood something when your brain was actually allowed to be the brain it was. Making connections between things he'd read. Asking questions that had edges on them. Ragnarok visited each day. The visits were ostensibly to review the legal documentation being assembled, and they did do that, working through the indexed record of 73 spells with their classifications and Dumbledore's magical signature on each one, through the financial audit with its trail of unauthorized withdrawals, but they were also, Harry recognized, something else. On the second day, during a pause in the documentation review, Harry said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the case?" Ragnarok set down his quill. "Yes." "Why are you doing this?" Harry said. "Not Gringotts, I understand the institutional reasons. The treaty violations, the illegal enchantments, the financial irregularities. Those are all things Gringotts has an interest in documenting and pursuing." He paused. "I mean you. You've spent more time on this than an auditor needs to. You come here to check on me every day. You told me to count quartz veins. He looked at Ragnock levelly. Why? The goblin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger on the table between them, then away. When he spoke, his voice was measured but not uninvested. In 1782, he said, the wizard known as Bartholomew Crest, who held a senior position in the British Ministry of Magic, cast a series of enchantments on a goblin settlement in the Scottish Highlands. Compliance enchantments. Memory modifications. The intent was to make the goblins more, he paused on the word as though it tasted bad. Cooperative. The settlement didn't know what had been done to them for 6 years. When the enchantments were discovered and removed, 3 goblins never recovered their full cognitive function. The case was brought before the Wisengamot. Crest received a fine. He was quiet. A fine, Harry said. A fine, Ragnock said. The official position of the ministry was that the goblins, while technically victims, had also been functionally non-compliant in the years prior to the enchantments, and that Crest's actions, while illegal, needed to be understood in context. He looked at Harry. Context. That was the word they used. Harry understood then. Not just the answer to his question, but something larger about why Ragnock's precise, honest, gold-standard treatment of him felt as radical as it did. It wasn't personal, or rather, it was personal, but it was also principled in a way that went deeper than one case or one person. Dumbledore cast compliance enchantments on a child, Harry said. Yes. And the people who should be furious about that will probably argue context. Yes, Ragnock said. Which is why we are not relying on fury. We are relying on documentation. On the 3rd day, Harry asked about Sirius Black. He'd been building toward this. He'd read what the goblins' records contained, which was more than the newspapers, because Gringotts had its own intelligence on matters that intersected with their clients' affairs, and the Potter estate was their client. He knew that Sirius Black was in Azkaban. He knew that Sirius Black had been Harry's parents' closest friend, had been named Harry's godfather in James Potter's will, a will that the goblins had a copy of, filed appropriately and systematically overlooked, and had never had a trial. He went directly to Azkaban, Harry said. It wasn't quite a question. Ragnock, who had been expecting this, didn't look surprised. Yes. Without a trial. Yes. Harry thought about that. Is that legal? Under emergency wartime provisions invoked at the time, the ministry argued it was. The legal community has argued both ways since. The question has never been formally adjudicated because no one with standing has brought it. I have standing, Harry said. Ragnock looked at him. I'm his godson, Harry said. If he's never had a trial, that means there's been no legal determination of his guilt. And I have, he gestured at the stack of documentation on the table. Already established that the person who put me in Privet Drive instead of with my godfather had no legal authority to make that choice. So Dumbledore illegally diverted me from my legal guardian, who was then imprisoned without trial on the basis of, he stopped. What is he actually convicted of? Officially? The murder of 12 muggles and a wizard named Peter Pettigrew. And unofficially? Unofficially, Ragnock said, there are questions. Significant questions. The evidence at the scene was, he paused. Incomplete, in ways that were not examined at the time. Harry nodded slowly. Peter Pettigrew. Is there a body? Ragnock opened his satchel and found a specific document. A finger, he said. They recovered a finger. Harry stared at him. A finger. A finger. And that was sufficient to convict a man to life imprisonment without a trial. There was no conviction. There was no trial. He was simply imprisoned, Harry said. Right. He looked at the window with its impossible highland view. A cloud moved across the gray sky. He thought about a man he'd never met, sitting in a prison on the basis of a finger and someone else's certainty, 5 years and counting, while the person who'd put him there had also spent those 5 years quietly running every aspect of Harry's existence. "When we start the legal process," Harry said, "we're including him." "I anticipated this," Ragnarok said. He produced another document from the satchel. "I have already begun a preliminary file." Harry looked at the document. At the top, in bronze ink, black, Sirius Orion. Wrongful imprisonment inquiry, preliminary filing. Something happened in his chest. Not warmth, exactly. More like the moment when you're very cold and someone hands you something hot and the cold starts to lose its certainty. "Thank you," he said. Ragnarok inclined his head. The alert came on the evening of the third day, when Harry was reading and the goblin healer had just been to verify his core stabilization figures were holding steady and been satisfied enough that she'd mentioned discharge in the morning. Ragnarok came in quickly, which for him, a person whose baseline was deliberate and unhurried, was the equivalent of someone else running. "Dumbledore has noticed," he said. Harry set down his book. "How?" "He went to Privet Drive today." Mrs. Dursley was apparently persuaded, through means we're still identifying, that Harry Potter had simply wandered off and would likely return. But Dumbledore is not Mrs. Dursley. Ragnarok set his satchel on the table and opened it. He has been communicating with ministry contacts. He has not yet made an official inquiry, but the volume and pattern of his communications in the last 6 hours suggests he is aware something has changed. "The spells," Harry said. He felt them go. "Almost certainly. The removal of a complex enchantment array does produce a magical signature that an alert caster could detect." Ragnarok withdrew 2 documents. "He'll know the signature is Gringotts. That tells him who has you and approximately what we've done. He doesn't yet know what we have documented, but he will begin working on the assumption that we have everything." "Because we do have everything," Harry said. "Yes." Harry thought for a moment. "What does he do now?" "In your assessment." Ragnarok sat down across from him. 3 options. First, he approaches Gringotts directly, attempts to negotiate a quiet resolution. This is his preferred mode, control the situation before it becomes public. Second, he goes to the ministry and attempts to use legal mechanisms to remove you from goblin custody before the documentation can be filed. Third, he waits and gathers information before acting. "He'll do the third one first," Harry said. "He won't move on incomplete information. He needs to know exactly what we have before he decides whether to negotiate or suppress." He paused. "But he won't wait long, because waiting gives us more time to build the case." Ragnarok looked at him. "Agreed. So how long do we actually have?" 3 days. Perhaps 4. Before he makes a move that requires us to respond in the public domain. Ragnarok laid both documents on the table. "Which is why I have been preparing these." He turned them so Harry could see. The first document was a formal legal filing with the Goblin Wizard Treaty Council, a body with international authority that predated and superseded the British ministry, invoking specific treaty clauses against the illegal enchantment of children. Filed, it created an automatic investigation that neither Dumbledore's Wisengamot position or his ministry allies could quietly close. The second document was a letter to Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Harry read the letter. It was precise and dry and devastating. 3 pages, evidential summary only, with the full documentation referenced as attachments. It did not accuse. It did not argue. It simply stated what had been found, what the signatures confirmed, and what relevant statutes those findings engaged. "She has a reputation," Ragnarok said, "for taking evidence seriously. Regardless of who it implicates." Harry looked up. "You've been preparing this since before the cleansing." "I began the treaty filing on the 2nd day after your audit," Ragnarok said. "Before we had your consent for the cleansing, I was already documenting." Because even if you'd chosen not to proceed, the audit findings themselves were legally reportable. He paused. But I wanted to give you the choice to proceed first. To give you the removal first, before the legal fight began. Because you deserve to be, he stopped. Yourself, Harry said. Yes, Ragnox said. You deserve to be yourself first. Harry looked at the two documents on the table for a long time. Outside the enchanted window, the highland sky had gone full dark, and the view had shifted to show a sweep of stars above the mountains that Harry was fairly certain was real, pulled from somewhere the enchantment could reach. File them, he said. Ragnox picked up the quill. Harry was officially discharged from Gringotts medical supervision the following morning, with a core stability report that the healer described in gobbledygook and Ragnox translated as aggressively healthy. The legal filings had been submitted before dawn. The Treaty Council had already acknowledged receipt. Amelia Bone's office had, according to Gringotts Ministry contact, received the letter and package at 7:15 that morning. It was 8:30 now, and Harry was standing in the lobby of Gringotts proper for the first time, the soaring, busy, organized chaotic main hall, while Ragnox arranged for him to access Vault 687 for the first time. The Trust Vault. The one with 5 years of unauthorized withdrawals already removed from it, but still, as Crickle had noted with the tone of someone pointing out that a glass was still mostly full despite having been partially drained, quite substantial. Harry stood in the lobby and looked around. He'd been here before, sort of. But he'd been 6 years old and too focused on the audit and too layered in enchantments to properly see it. Now, without the dampening spells, without the compliance layers, without any of the 73 things that had been working on his perception since before he could remember, the lobby was different. It was alive in a way he hadn't registered. Not just busy. Alive. The magic in the building was a constant, low-level presence the way sound was in a busy street, not one thing but a composite of hundreds of things, each distinct, each contributing to the whole. He could feel the vault corridors below as a kind of downward pull, dense and heavy with accumulated magical charge. He could feel the ward lines in the walls the way you could feel a bass note through your feet. He looked at his own hands. He hadn't done anything consciously magical yet. He was being careful about that, not cautious exactly, but deliberate. Wanting to understand what he had before he used it. But standing in the lobby with his perceptions fully open for the first time, he could feel his own magic the way you could feel your heartbeat when you put your hand to your chest. It was there. It was steady. It was, he searched for the word, enormous wasn't quite right, because it wasn't about size. It was about depth. Like looking down into water and not being able to see the bottom. He was still looking at his hands when someone spoke beside him. "You're Harry Potter." He looked up. A girl about his age, maybe a year older, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and wearing robes that were well-made but not ostentatious, was standing 3 feet away, looking at him with the direct, unembarrassed curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned to pretend not to stare. "Yes," Harry said. "I'm Nessa," she said. "Nessa Egby. My dad's doing some kind of banking thing." She tilted her head toward the counter where a tall man in robes was in animated conversation with a goblin. "Are you here for banking?" "Sort of," Harry said. "More legal things." She nodded, considering this. "Are you actually 6? My dad said you'd be 6. Harry blinked. "He knows about me." "Most people do." "You're famous." She said it without reverence or excitement, the way you'd say someone was tall. "Just a fact. You killed you-know-who." "I was 1 year old," Harry said. "I don't think I get much credit for that." She laughed. It was a quick, genuine laugh, the kind you didn't see coming until it was already happening. "Fair point." She looked at him for a moment more. "Why do you look like that?" "Like what?" "Like someone who's been thinking very hard about something and is trying to decide whether to be angry about it." Harry stared at her. Then he said, "I've had a complicated week." She nodded sagely, as though she received this information regularly. "My dad says the whole wizarding world is about to have a complicated week when whatever Gringotts is doing becomes public." She glanced at him again, and there was something sharper underneath the casual observation. "Is that because of you?" Harry thought about the 2 documents filed before dawn. He thought about Amelia Bones receiving a package at 7:15 this morning. He thought about a soul tether left in place and a man in Azkaban who'd never had a trial. "Possibly," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good," she said. "Things probably need complicating." Her father called her name from the counter, and she turned to go, then glanced back. "Good luck with your banking," she said. "Or legal things. Whatever." She walked away across the marble floor, and Harry watched her go with the strange sensation of having just had, possibly, his first actual conversation with a person his own age, not performing normalcy, not calculating what to reveal and what to hide, just talking. He filed the sensation away alongside the Highland stars and the feeling of the vault corridors beneath his feet. Ragnarok appeared at his elbow. "Ready?" "Yes," Harry said. They went down. The vaults were everything and nothing like what he'd imagined. The cart was real, the tunnels were real, the particular sound of wheels on ancient rails and the rush of warm air from below. Vault 687 was smaller than he'd expected, with none of the dramatic piled treasure he'd half imagined, mostly neat stacks of galleons, a few locked boxes, some documents. Crickle had noted it was a trust vault, designed for practical access rather than hoarding. Harry took a small, deliberate amount. Enough for a year's worth of actual clothes, decent food, and books. He had very specific ideas about books. He stood in the vault for a moment, looking at it. His parents' money. James and Lily Potter had worked and lived and earned this and left it for him, in the genuine original intent that he'd be raised by people who cared for him and would use it to do so. He took what he needed and left the rest. On the cart ride back up, Harry said, "How long until Dumbledore makes his first move, do you think?" Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Given that the filings were submitted at dawn and the ministry letter was delivered at 7:15. "I would estimate he knows about both by this afternoon. He'll need time to assess. He'll want to speak with allies." He paused. "Tomorrow morning." "I would expect something tomorrow morning." Harry nodded. The cart curved up through the dark tunnel, and ahead of them the glow of the main vault level spread warmly across the rails. "Good," Harry said. "That gives us the rest of today." For what? Harry thought about accountability. About Sirius Black in Azkaban. About Amelia Bones reading 3 pages of precise, dry, devastating documentation over her morning coffee. Planning, he said. For what comes next. The cart reached the main level and stopped. Harry climbed out and stood in the warm underground light and felt his own magic like a depth of water that had no visible floor. He was 6 years old and 7 days free. Above him, across the city, in a tower office at the Ministry of Magic, a woman was reading a letter with very careful attention. And in Hogwarts, in an office full of silver instruments and the soft sounds of sleeping portraits, a man who had not yet lost had not yet fully understood that the game had changed. Not yet. Chapter 3, The Evidence. The Owl arrived at Amelia Bones' office at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, which was 20 minutes before she normally arrived, which meant it had been sitting on her desk for 20 minutes when she walked in, and the first thing she saw was the Gringotts seal on a package roughly the thickness of a small novel. She took off her monocle, polished it, put it back on, and looked at the package again. Then she set down her coffee, closed her office door, and opened it. She read it twice before she called anyone. The first read was fast, the letter first, then a skim of the attached documentation, eyes moving quickly, the way she'd learned to read case files in her first year as an Auror when there were too many and too little time and you had to learn what was signal and what was noise. The second read was slow. Methodical. Each page turned deliberately, each notation examined, each piece of evidence cross-referenced against the statutes cited in the margins. By the time she finished the second read, her coffee was cold. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up a quill and began making notes. Not notes about the case. Notes about who she could trust. This was, in her experience, always the first and most important question, and it was always harder than it looked. The DMLE was her department and she ran it well and she trusted her people, but trusted them with what? With a routine investigation, absolutely. With an investigation into the illegal enchantment of the most famous child in the wizarding world by the most powerful man in Britain? That was a different calibration entirely. That was the kind of case where good people with no bad intentions could become problems simply by mentioning it to the wrong person at lunch. She wrote 3 names. Crossed out one. Added another. Looked at the list. Then she wrote, at the top of the page, Harry Potter, age 6, currently in Gringotts custody. She underlined custody twice. She stood up, put on her outer robe, and went 2 floors up to a records room that most people forgot existed because it was tucked behind a filing corridor and required a specific authorization code to access. The records inside were sealed case files, not the main archive, which was accessible to senior ministry staff, but the secondary archive, which held files that had been flagged for sensitivity and pulled from general circulation. She was looking for the serious black file. She found it in 40 minutes of searching, which told her something all by itself. Files that were legitimately filed took 5 minutes to locate, and files that took 40 minutes were either misfiled by incompetence or buried by design. She pulled it out, took it back to her office, locked her door, and read it. By the time she finished, she'd filled 2 pages of notes and her jaw was set in the particular way her staff had learned to recognize as someone is about to have a very bad day and it isn't going to be Madam Bones. There was no trial transcript. There was no trial date. There was no record of legal representation being offered or waived. There was a ministry incident report from the scene, 1 page, sparse, listing the physical evidence, 1 street, 12 dead muggles, 1 dead wizard, and 1 finger identified by matching records as belonging to Peter Pettigrew. There was Sirius Black's arrest record. And then the next document was his Azkaban intake form. Nothing in between. She pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began writing a letter. Harry didn't know about Amelia Bones' mourning until Ragnarok told him about it 2 days later, by which point he'd spent those 2 days in a set of rooms that Gringotts had designated as his formal temporary residence under the Treaty Protection Clause, comfortable rooms, private, with the enchanted window that still showed the Highlands and a small study where he'd arranged the books he'd bought in a specific order that made sense to him and probably nobody else. He'd been studying. Not the way school required studying, passive absorption of prescribed information in the right sequence at the right time. Studying the way he apparently naturally studied when nobody was bending his compass needle, which was to find a question and follow it down as far as it went regardless of where it led. The question he was currently following was, what are the actual legal mechanisms by which an unjust imprisonment can be challenged, and what evidence is required at each stage? He had 4 books open simultaneously, a roll of parchment half filled with notes in his own developing shorthand, and a cup of tea that had gone cold because he kept forgetting it was there. When Ragnarok came in and told him about Amelia Bones, that she'd read the documentation, that she'd accessed the black file, that she'd sent letters to 3 specific people whose names Ragnarok named, Harry put his quill down and felt something settle in his chest. "She's taking it seriously," he said. "She is," Ragnarok said. "She's also moving carefully, which is appropriate given who is implicated. She has not yet contacted Dumbledore directly, which suggests she understands that premature contact would compromise the investigation." "Who did she write to?" Ragnarok consulted his notes. Griselda Marchbanks, senior Wisengamot member, known for institutional independence. Tiberius Ogden, another senior member, similar reputation. And an Auror named Kingsley Shacklebolt, who she apparently trusts absolutely. Harry filed the names. Has Dumbledore moved yet? Yes. Ragnock sat down across from him. Yesterday afternoon. He came to Gringotts. Harry went still. Here. He requested a meeting with the director. Director Riphook met with him for 45 minutes. Ragnock's expression was carefully neutral, which Harry had learned meant the goblin had strong feelings he was choosing not to lead with. Dumbledore was cordial. He expressed concern for your welfare. He suggested that the Gringotts audit had uncovered information that, taken without context, might appear alarming but that had a complex history requiring careful explanation. Context, Harry said. His word. What did Riphook say? That Gringotts' obligations to its clients are not subject to external contextualization, and that the treaty filings had already been submitted and were therefore outside the bank's ability to retract regardless of any subsequent conversation. Ragnock allowed himself a very brief pause. Dumbledore was also cordial about this. He's not alarmed yet, Harry said. He's still managing. Yes. But he asked one question at the end of the meeting that suggests he is beginning to understand the scope of what has been filed. Ragnock looked at him steadily. He asked whether you had expressed any interest in the matter of Sirius Black. Harry looked back at him. And? Riphook told him that client communications were confidential. Which tells him yes, Harry said. Which tells him you are not simply a 6-year-old who wandered into an audit, Ragnock said. Yes. Harry leaned back. He thought about what Dumbledore would do with that information. The man had spent 5 years maintaining a specific architecture, Harry in Privet Drive, Sirius in Azkaban, the enchantments in place, the inheritance quietly drawn on, every piece positioned for a specific long-term purpose. The architecture had just developed a significant structural problem. What did you do when your architecture developed a problem? You reinforced the load-bearing elements. The things the whole structure depended on most. He'll go to the ministry about Sirius, Harry said. Not to expose the wrongful imprisonment, to reinforce the conviction. To make sure that peace stays locked. He frowned. He'll argue that Black is too dangerous to consider releasing. He'll use his Wizengamot position to preempt any inquiry Bones might be trying to open. Ragnock was quiet for a moment. That is also my assessment. So we need to move faster than he does. Harry straightened. What do we actually have on the Black case? Not the illegal enchantments, he can argue context on those, as much as it makes me sick to say it. But Sirius specifically. If we're going to get him a trial, what's our strongest argument? Ragnock opened his satchel. This was, Harry had noted, a satchel of apparently infinite depth, because it always seemed to contain exactly the document the situation required. The strongest argument is the simplest one. Sirius Black was never tried. In the absence of a trial, there is no conviction to challenge, only an imprisonment to question. Under the Wizarding Rights Charter of 1689, any imprisoned individual who has not been tried within 2 years of their imprisonment is entitled to a mandatory review. Harry stared at him. That law exists? It does. And it's been 5 years. Nearly 6, Ragnock said. The clause has never been invoked in a high-profile case because the clause requires someone with legal standing to bring the petition. His godson, Harry said. His godson, Ragnock confirmed. Harry took the document Ragnock offered, the legal framework, the charter clause, the petition structure. He read through it quickly, efficiently, the way he'd been reading everything since the cleansing, not consuming but thinking through, following the logic, looking for gaps. Dumbledore is the chief warlock, he said. He controls the Wizengamot scheduling. He could delay the review indefinitely just by never putting it on the agenda. He could, Ragnock said. If the petition were filed with the Wizengamot. Harry looked up. The charter predates the Wizengamot, Ragnock said. The review petition is filed with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It is Amelia Bones' jurisdiction entirely. And there it was. She already has our documentation, Harry said slowly. And she's already reading the black file. If we file the review petition directly with her office, she has 60 days to schedule the review, Ragnarok said. And she cannot be overruled on scheduling by the chief warlock, because the charter explicitly reserves that authority to the DMLE head. Harry looked at the petition framework in his hands. He looked at it the way you looked at a key when you'd been studying a lock for a long time and had finally understood the mechanism. File it, he said. Today. The response from Bones' office came in 3 days, which was fast. The statutory period allowed 15. It was a single page, formal and tight, acknowledging receipt of the review petition and confirming a preliminary hearing date 4 weeks out. At the bottom, in handwriting that was clearly Bones' own rather than a secretary's, a single added line: "I would like to meet with the petitioner and their representative at their earliest convenience." Harry read it. Then he handed it back to Ragnarok. "She wants to meet me," he said. "Yes. Is that standard?" "No," Ragnarok said. The petitioner in a mandatory review case is not typically required to appear until the hearing itself. He looked at the letter. "She wants to assess you." "I know." Harry thought about this. "Can you find out who Kingsley Shacklebolt is? Not just his name, what kind of person he is." Ragnarok gave him a look that combined slight surprise with approval. "Already done. Auror for 9 years, exemplary record, known for being methodical and resistant to political pressure. His loyalty is to the law rather than to any institutional figure, which is somewhat unusual for someone who has advanced as far as he has." He paused. "He is also, as of 3 days ago, apparently assigned to Madame Bones' direct staff." "So she's already building her team for this," Harry said. "It appears so." Harry nodded. "Set up the meeting." 2 days later, he was sitting across a conference table from Amelia Bones. She was not what he'd expected, though he'd read everything the goblins had on her and formed a mental image that was probably too abstract: competent authority figure without enough specificity. The reality was more concrete and more interesting. She was in her mid-40s, solidly built, with short-cropped gray hair and a monocle she wore with the easy habit of long practice. She looked at him the way she probably looked at everything: carefully, directly, without any of the softening that adults usually applied when they were talking to children. Harry appreciated this immediately. Beside her sat Kingsley Shacklebolt, who was tall and broad-shouldered and very still in the particular way that meant he was paying close attention to everything in the room simultaneously. He had a notebook open in front of him but hadn't written in it yet. Ragnarok sat beside Harry. The conference room was on neutral ground, not Gringotts, not the ministry, but a private room in a law firm that dealt in wizard-goblin treaty matters and had therefore been vetted by both parties. Bones looked at Harry for a long moment after introductions were done. Then she said, "I've read everything in the package Gringotts sent." "All right," Harry said. "I have questions." "I expected you would." She tilted her head slightly, and he had the sense she was recalibrating something. "How old are you, precisely?" 6, Harry said. 7 in July. "And you understand the nature of these proceedings? What it means to formally petition for a mandatory review in a case of this profile?" "Yes," Harry said. "It means that Sirius Black gets a hearing he should have had 6 years ago. It means a court, a real one, with evidence presented and examined properly, has to look at whether there's actually a legal basis for his imprisonment." He paused. "And it means that the same documentation we filed with the Treaty Council, which establishes a pattern of illegal actions taken by the same person who facilitated Black's imprisonment, is now part of the same general evidentiary record." Bones looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Ragnarok. "He speaks for himself in meetings?" "He does," Ragnarok said. "I speak on the legal particulars when required. Everything else is his. She returned to Harry. The documentation from your audit. 73 illegal enchantments. She said it flatly, the way you said something when you needed to say it out loud to fully believe it. All bearing the same signature. Yes. You understand that Albus Dumbledore has approximately 70 years of institutional standing and the loyalty of most of the ministry and the majority of the Wisengamot. She wasn't warning him off, it wasn't that kind of statement. It was a calibration question. Do you understand what you're in? Yes, Harry said. That's why we filed with the Treaty Council first. Because that's outside his jurisdiction. And it's why we came to you second, because the mandatory review is your jurisdiction and he can't override it. He looked at her steadily. I'm not trying to embarrass him or punish him. Not yet. I'm trying to get Sirius Black a trial. That's the first thing. Everything else is the second thing. Something shifted in Bones' expression. Not warmth, exactly, she wasn't warm in the conventional sense, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone who had been expecting one thing and found another. The evidence on Black, she said. Walk me through what you have beyond the charter petition. The will, Harry said. Ragnarok produced it. James and Lily Potter's will, filed with Gringotts in October 1979 and conveniently never entered into the ministry's probate records. It names Sirius Black as primary magical guardian and specifies that in the event of incapacitation or death of both parents, Harry Potter is to be placed in his care. It names Dumbledore in no capacity whatsoever. Bones took the will. She read it. She passed it to Shacklebolt without comment. The arrest record, Harry continued. Ragnarok produced this too. 1 page. No witness statements, though there were witnesses. Peter Pettigrew's other school friends, at minimum, should have been interviewed. No forensic examination of the scene beyond the basic physical description. And the physical evidence itself, Harry paused. A finger. They identified Peter Pettigrew as dead based on a finger and Black's presence at the scene. That was the horror team's determination at the time, Shacklebolt said. It was the first thing he'd said, and his voice was deep and measured. I wasn't on the team, but I know the people who were. I'm not saying they were wrong to conclude what they concluded, Harry said carefully. I'm saying the conclusion was never tested in a court of law. There was no trial where Black could present an alternative account. There was no trial at all. He looked at Shacklebolt. If there had been, and Black had been convicted, that would be one thing. But there wasn't. Shacklebolt was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. If Pettigrew is alive, Bones said, where is he? That's one of the things a proper investigation would establish, Harry said. We don't know. What we have is significant doubt about the evidentiary basis for the assumption that he's dead, which is enough for the charter petition and should be enough for a full inquiry. Bones set the will on the table and looked at it. Then she looked at Harry. If I schedule this review and Dumbledore moves to block it, he can't block the scheduling, Harry said. That's your authority. He can make it very difficult politically. He's going to make everything difficult politically, Harry said. That's not a reason not to do the right thing. You know it isn't. It was a direct thing to say to a senior ministry official, possibly presumptuous, and for a moment the room was very quiet. Shacklebolt looked up from his notebook. Ragnarok was still. Then Bones made a sound that was almost a laugh. No, she said, it isn't. She straightened the papers on the table into a precise stack. I'll want affidavits from the Gringotts Cursebreakers on the enchantment removal procedure and findings. I'll want the full financial audit separately packaged for a potential financial crimes inquiry. That's a different team and a different process, but it needs to run parallel. Already prepared, Ragnarok said. I'll want, she stopped. She looked at Harry. What do you want from this meeting, specifically? Not the legal outcome. What do you want? Harry thought about the question. It was a good question, asked plainly, and it deserved a plain answer. I want Sirius Black to have a real trial and I want him to walk out of it free, he said. I want the person who put all those spells on me to have to answer for them publicly, in a forum that can't be quietly managed or contextualized away. And I want those two things to happen in the right order, Black first, because he's been in Azkaban for 6 years and every day matters, and the rest second, because it's more complicated and Dumbledore will fight harder and I need more time to do it properly. Bones looked at him for a long moment. The hearing is in 4 weeks, she said. Be ready. He was 7 years old when the hearing was scheduled. His birthday happened in the 3rd week of the 4, and he spent it in the Gringotts study with his books and his notes, and Ragnarok produced a piece of chocolate cake from somewhere without explanation or ceremony, and Harry ate it while reading about the history of mandatory review hearings and thought that it was probably the best birthday he'd had so far, which wasn't a high bar but was nonetheless true. In the week between the meeting with Bones and the hearing, several things happened. Dumbledore published an editorial in the Daily Prophet. He didn't mention Harry by name, but he didn't need to. The wizarding world was small enough that recent developments concerning the welfare of our most celebrated young survivor was plenty specific. The editorial was masterfully written, which Harry expected. It expressed deep personal concern for the well-being of all parties involved, gently noted the complexity of decisions made in wartime and in the immediate chaotic aftermath of great conflict, and closed with a reflection on the importance of protecting children from the weight of adult political disputes. Harry read it 3 times. Then he wrote a response. Not for the Prophet, he had no expectation they'd print it, and a 6-year-old publishing editorials would look exactly as strange as it was. He wrote it for himself, as an exercise, picking apart every rhetorical move in Dumbledore's piece and identifying the function each one served. By the end he had 2 pages of analysis and a much clearer map of how Dumbledore thought. He showed it to Ragnarok. The goblin read it carefully. This is useful, he said. I know, Harry said. Because every one of these moves, the complexity defense, the wartime context defense, the protecting children from political disputes framing, he's going to use all of them at the hearing. And if we're going to counter them effectively, we need to know what order he'll deploy them in and what each one is designed to do to the audience. The audience at a mandatory review hearing is the DMLE panel, Ragnarok said. Bones and 2 appointed senior aurors. And the public record, Harry said. Which Dumbledore knows will be accessed. He's not just arguing to the panel. He's arguing to the story that gets told afterward. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. You're saying his primary concern at the hearing won't be the legal outcome. His primary concern will be the narrative, Harry said. He knows Bones is probably going to grant the review, he's not stupid enough to think he can stop that. What he's going to try to control is how it's framed. So that even if Black gets a hearing, the dominant story is still Dumbledore did difficult things for difficult reasons and means well. And what do we do about that? Harry thought. We don't try to out-narrative him. We don't argue about intentions or context or complexity at all. We just keep bringing it back to the evidence. Facts. Statutes. The law as written. He paused. Because the only thing that's genuinely immune to his framing is specificity. You can't contextualize a date. Ragnarok looked at him with those amber eyes. You can't contextualize a date, he repeated. There's no trial record. That's a date, or rather, a missing date. November 1981 to present, no trial. No statute authorizes that gap. No complexity of wartime circumstances creates an exception to the charter. It's just, missing. And that's what we put in front of the panel, over and over, however many times the other side tries to take the conversation somewhere more comfortable. Ragnarok nodded slowly. I'll brief the legal team. Brief them that I'll be present for the hearing. Ragnarok looked at him. You intend to testify? I intend to petition in person, Harry said. I'm the petitioner. I have standing. And there's something about, he stopped, finding the words. There's something about a 7-year-old standing in front of a DMLE panel and articulating exactly why his godfather deserves a trial that is very difficult to argue context around. Not because I want to use myself as a prop. But because it's true. I'm the person most directly affected by both the illegal enchantments and the wrongful imprisonment, and my presence is the most honest representation of what this case actually is. Ragnarok was quiet for a long moment. I'll add you to the petitioner's appearance list, he said. 3 days before the hearing, Narcissa Malfoy sent a letter to Gringotts. Harry was in the middle of reviewing the final evidentiary package when Ragnarok brought it in and set it on his desk without comment, which was Ragnarok's way of saying this is notable but I'm not going to tell you what to think about it. The letter was brief. It was written in precise, elegant script on paper that had a faint silver shimmer. It said that the writer had become aware of recent legal proceedings and wished to offer certain information that might be relevant, in confidence, at a meeting of the writer's choosing. It was signed NM and contained no other identifying information, though the paper's watermark told its own story to anyone who knew the Malfoy family crest. Harry set it down. He looked at Ragnarok. Why would she contact us, he said. That is an interesting question, Ragnarok said. Lucius Malfoy is one of Dumbledore's most useful political enemies, Harry said, thinking through it. Not allies, enemies. They hate each other, publicly. Malfoy uses his Wisengamot seat to oppose Dumbledore's initiatives on principle. Which means Narcissa contacting us isn't a pro-Dumbledore move. No. Is she trying to use us for something? Get information about the scope of the case that benefits the Malfoys somehow? Possibly, Ragnarok said. Or she may genuinely have information she believes is relevant. What information would a Malfoy have that we don't? The Malfoys move in circles we don't have access to, Ragnarok said. Ministry corridors. Old family political networks. Social spaces where things are said that never make it into documents. He paused. And Narcissa Malfoy is not Lucius Malfoy. She is intelligent, politically astute in her own right, and, this is relevant, the cousin of Sirius Black. Harry had not known that. He looked at the letter again. She knows him, Harry said. They grew up together. The Black family tree is extensive and complicated. Sirius's incarceration would have affected her, not openly, given that the Malfoys' public position on the war required a certain distance from the wrong side of the Black family, but possibly more than she's ever been in a position to say. Harry thought about this. He thought about Dumbledore's editorial and the way it had used complexity as a shield. He thought about how the most interesting information in any situation always came from the most unexpected directions. Set up the meeting, he said. Neutral ground. She picks the location, we pick the date. You're not concerned about her agenda? I'm concerned about everyone's agenda, Harry said. Including mine. But concern doesn't mean avoidance, it means you go in with your eyes open. Narcissa Malfoy chose a tea room in Diagon Alley that was quiet and expensive and slightly hidden, tucked at the end of a side passage that most shoppers didn't bother going down. She was already there when Harry and Ragnarok arrived, seated at a corner table, back to the wall, in grey robes that were perfectly tailored and perfectly unremarkable. She was fair-haired and fine-boned and looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had spent her entire life in rooms where the game was always being played and had learned to play it better than anyone else in the room without ever appearing to play at all. She looked at Harry when he sat down and did the same thing Bones had done, recalibrated. Harry was used to it. You're smaller than I expected, she said. I get that a lot, Harry said. Something very brief crossed her face. You spoke with Amelia Bones. Yes. She'll give Sirius his hearing. Yes. Narcissa looked at her teacup. He's been in there for 6 years. She said it quietly, without visible emotion, which was somehow more affecting than any amount of emotion would have been. I know what Azkaban does to people. I know. She stopped. Started again. I was told, in 1981, that he'd gone mad. That he'd laughed at the scene when they arrested him. That the man I knew had simply collapsed into something else. I was told to accept this and move on. Who told you that? Harry said. She looked at him. Dumbledore, she said. At a dinner, 3 months after your parents died. Very gently, very kindly, the way he does everything. He told me that Sirius had broken completely and that grief was better than false hope. She paused. I believed him. For years, I believed him. And now? Now I have a 7-year-old petitioning for a mandatory review on the basis of evidence that suggests nothing about that situation was as presented. She looked at him steadily. And now I have an 8-year-old son who I'm beginning to understand is being shaped by the same kind of institutional machinery that shaped the situation in 1981. Not the same person. Not the same spells. But the same. She searched for the word. Architecture, Harry said. She blinked. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Draco is not a bad child. I need you to understand that. He is a child who is being given very particular ideas about the world and very particular ideas about himself, and he doesn't yet know that ideas given to you without your consent are the most dangerous kind. Harry thought about 73 spells. He thought about compass needles. What do you want to tell me? He said. She reached into her bag and produced an envelope. She set it on the table between them. There is a conversation, she said carefully, that took place 3 weeks ago in the ministry, in the private dining room on the 4th floor, between Dumbledore and the Minister for Magic and 2 senior Wizengamot members. I was not present. My husband was. She looked at the envelope. And my husband, who is not a subtle man in the way he thinks I don't know things, wrote it down afterward in a letter to an associate, a copy of which passed through my hands because my husband's correspondence passes through my hands. Harry looked at the envelope. He was briefing them, she said. On the review petition. On your situation. He was. Another pause, and this one had something in it that was close to anger, controlled but present. He was framing it. For them. Building the counter-narrative. She pushed the envelope across the table. He mentioned specific things he intends to argue at the hearing. Specific framings. Specific, she stopped. Specific references to your mental and emotional stability, which he apparently plans to question on the grounds that a 7-year-old in goblin custody making legal claims has been improperly influenced by parties with an institutional interest in discrediting him. The room was quiet. Harry picked up the envelope. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it and read the letter inside. It was damning. Not in the dramatic sense, there were no confessions, no explicit admissions. But as a document of intent, of preparation, of the specific rhetorical tools Dumbledore had selected and was sharpening for the hearing, it was exactly as useful as Narcissa had indicated. He was going to argue Harry's credibility. He was going to argue goblin institutional bias. He was going to be careful and measured and devastatingly effective. Except now Harry knew the argument before it was made. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. What do you want? He asked Narcissa. Because she'd said it herself, everyone had an agenda, and acknowledging it was more useful than pretending it didn't exist. She looked at him levelly. I want my son not to become what they're building him to be, she said. I want Sirius to get his trial. And I want, she paused. I want someone to understand that there are people inside these old families who are trapped by the same architecture you described, and that not all of them are villains. Some of us are just trying to navigate. I understand that, Harry said. He meant it. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softening, because Narcissa Malfoy didn't soften, but opening slightly. Like a window that had been latched being unlatched but not yet pushed wide. "You have an extraordinary amount of composure for someone your age," she said. "I had a lot of time to think in a very small room," Harry said. She almost smiled. It was a very small almost smile, there and gone, but it was real. "Be careful at the hearing," she said. "He will try to make you angry. It's what he does when he can't control the information, he tries to destabilize the person delivering it. He'll say something about your parents. About what he did and why." She looked at Harry steadily. "He will make it sound reasonable and loving and enormously sad. And part of it," she stopped. "Part of it might even be true. That's what makes it effective." "I know," Harry said. She nodded once, stood, dropped coins on the table for the tea, and left. Harry sat with the letter in his pocket and Ragnarok beside him and a cup of tea he hadn't touched, and outside the tea-room window the busy street of Diagon Alley moved in its usual commerce, robes and owls and laughter and the smell of something sweet from the sweet shop 2 doors down. 3 days, Harry said. 3 days, Ragnarok confirmed. Harry picked up his tea. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The night before the hearing, Harry sat at the desk in his study and wrote a letter to Sirius Black. He didn't know if it would be delivered. He didn't know if Sirius was in a state to read it. He knew almost nothing about the man beyond documents and other people's memories, which was the strangest kind of knowing, a person assembled entirely from second-hand pieces. He wrote it anyway. "Dear Sirius, I don't know if you remember me. I was 1 year old the last time you saw me, so I certainly don't remember you, though I've been told, by your file, by a will, by the shape of a family I was kept away from, that you were supposed to be someone important in my life. Tomorrow there's going to be a hearing. Not your trial yet, that's what the hearing is trying to establish grounds for. But it's a step, and it's moving, and I wanted you to know that someone is moving it. I'm told you laughed. After the explosion, before they arrested you. I used to wonder why, before I knew anything, when you were just a name attached to a bad story. Now I think, and maybe I'm wrong, I think you laughed because the whole situation was so monstrous and so absurd and you couldn't do anything about any of it, and sometimes the only thing left to do in the face of something truly monstrous is to refuse to let it have the last word. Even if the only thing you have to refuse with is a laugh. I understand that, a bit. I've spent 6 years having my compass needle bent. The person who bent it made it look like care and love and the weight of difficult decisions, and everyone around him believed it because he's very good at that and because it's easier to believe than the alternative. I'm going to try to get you out. I can't promise how long it takes. But I'm trying, and I wanted you to know that, in case it matters. Harry Potter. He sealed it. He gave it to Ragnarok, who said he knew a way to get letters to Azkaban that bypassed the official postal screening. Then Harry went to bed, in the room with the enchanted window showing the Highland stars, and slept better than he expected. Chapter 4, The Trial. The hearing room smelled of old wood and older magic. It was on the 3rd floor of the Ministry of Magic, in a wing that saw less traffic than the main judicial levels, functional rather than impressive, with plain stone walls and a low ceiling and the particular quality of silence that accumulated in rooms where important things had been decided and not all of them well. 3 chairs sat behind a raised bench at the far end. A single chair in the center of the floor faced them. Along the walls, tiered benches for observers, not many, because this was technically a preliminary hearing and not open to the press, but the benches were fuller than they should have been, which told Harry something about how many people had decided that an obscure charter provision involving a 6-year-old and a famous prisoner was worth watching. He counted, without appearing to count, 14 observers. He recognized Griselda Marchbanks from descriptions Ragnarok had provided, old, sharp-faced, spine straight as a door frame. Tiberius Ogden beside her, heavier and slower in his movements but with eyes that missed nothing. Two people he didn't recognize who had the careful stillness of people paid to watch proceedings rather than participate in them. A young witch with a quick quotes quill which she was keeping conspicuously below the bench, which meant someone had told her no press and she'd decided to take notes quietly anyway. And near the back, in grey robes identical to yesterday's, Narcissa Malfoy. Dumbledore was not on the observer benches. This was notable. Harry had expected him to be present, watching, managing his position from the audience. His absence was almost more concerning than his presence would have been. It meant either that he'd decided the hearing wasn't worth engaging, which would have been a misjudgment, or that he was somewhere else doing something he considered more important, which was a different kind of problem. Harry filed it. He'd come back to it. Amelia Bones entered from a side door with two senior aurors and took the center chair. The aurors flanking her were introduced as Senior Auror Marcus Webb, a compact gray-haired man with a face like compressed rock, and Senior Auror Yelena Dragici, dark-eyed and watchful, who Harry had no records on but who Ragnarok had described as thorough and fair in equal measure. Bones opened a folder. She looked at it for a moment and then looked up at the room, and the room understood immediately that the slightly elevated noise of whispered conversations and shuffled papers was expected to stop. It stopped. This is a preliminary hearing under the Wizarding Rights Charter of 1689, Article 7, Mandatory Review Provision, Bones said. The matter before this panel is the imprisonment of Sirius Orain Black, currently held at Azkaban Prison, from November 1981 to present, a period of approximately 6 years, in the absence of trial or formal conviction. The petition for review has been filed by Harry James Potter, surviving heir of the Potter family and named magical godchild of the imprisoned individual under the will of James Charles Potter, dated October 1979. She looked at Harry. The petitioner is present and has invoked his right to appear in person. Mr. Potter, you may approach. Harry stood. He'd dressed carefully that morning, not in anything dramatic, but in clean, properly fitting clothes that Ragnarok had arranged without comment. Dark trousers, a plain grey shirt, shoes that were his size. He looked, he thought, like a child, which was exactly right. He was a child. He was also prepared. He walked to the chair in the center of the floor and sat in it. The chair was large enough that he looked small in it, which was also exactly right. Mr. Potter, Bones said, in your own words, please explain the basis of your petition. Harry had thought about how to begin this for 3 days. Not the words, he'd done enough preparation on the words. He'd thought about the tone. The room needed clarity, not drama. Precision, not emotion. He was the youngest person here by 20 years and that was an advantage only if he used it correctly, only if he was so plainly, specifically factual that the gap between his age and the seriousness of what he was saying did the emotional work on its own. Sirius Black was arrested in November 1981 on suspicion of murdering 12 Muggles and a wizard named Peter Pettigrew, he said. He was taken to Azkaban and he has been there since. There is no trial transcript because there was no trial. There is no conviction because there was none. Under Article 7 of the 1689 Charter, any individual imprisoned for more than 2 years without trial is entitled to a mandatory review of the basis for their continued imprisonment. Sirius Black has been imprisoned for nearly 6 years. He paused. That is the basis of my petition. Bones nodded. And you're standing as petitioner? Harry turned to Ragnarok, who was seated in the front observer row and produced a document on cue, delivering it to the clerk who brought it to the bench. The will of James and Lily Potter, Harry said, names Sirius Black as my primary magical guardian in the event of their deaths. This document was filed with Gringotts in 1979 and is legally valid. It was never entered into the ministry's probate records, which I would note is itself an irregularity that is part of a larger documented evidentiary record. He looked at Bones. As his named godchild under a valid legal document, I have standing. Senior Auror Webb leaned forward. Mr. Potter, I want to ask about the evidentiary record you mentioned. The documentation submitted with this petition is substantial. Can you speak to how this documentation was assembled? The Gringotts inheritance audit of my estate triggered a mandatory magical diagnostic, Harry said. The diagnostic found 73 illegal enchantments on my person, all bearing the same caster's signature. The documentation of those enchantments is part of the full record. It's relevant to this hearing because the same individual who cast those enchantments also arranged my placement with the Desley family after my parents' deaths, a placement that was contrary to the instructions in my parents' will, and because the circumstances of Sirius Black's imprisonment were shaped by decisions made by the same individual at the same time. The room had gone very still. Who is the individual in question? Dragici asked. Albus Dumbledore, Harry said. He said it clearly, without emphasis, without drama. The way you said a fact. The room absorbed it. On the observer benches, Griselda Marchbanks had gone absolutely expressionless, which was different from showing no reaction. Ogden was looking at his hands. The quick quotes witch's quill was moving fast. Mr. Potter, Bones said, I want to be precise about what you are and aren't claiming. Are you claiming that Albus Dumbledore arranged Sirius Black's wrongful imprisonment? I'm claiming that Sirius Black never had a trial, Harry said. I'm claiming that the evidence at the scene of his arrest was thin, was never tested in court, and was never subject to adversarial scrutiny. I'm claiming that a finger is not a body, and that the assumption of Pettigrew's death deserved more examination than it received. He paused. I'm not claiming to know exactly what happened that day. That's what a trial is for. Fairly answered, Webb said. The respondent's representative was a ministry solicitor named Donahue, grey-suited, precisely spoken, clearly competent, and clearly also in a position he hadn't asked to be in. He was representing the ministry's position on the imprisonment, not Dumbledore personally, but the distinction was thin enough to be mostly aesthetic. Donahue spent 20 minutes presenting the original basis for the imprisonment. He was professional about it, citing the emergency wartime provisions under which the arrest had been made and the ministerial authorization for the Azkaban detention. He made no reference to complexity or context. He was better than Harry had expected. Then he said, the panel should also consider the question of the petitioner's capacity to fully understand the proceedings in which he is participating, given his age and, the petitioner has legal standing under the Charter, Bones said. His age is not relevant to that standing. I'm not challenging his standing, Donahue said carefully. I'm raising a question about the petitioner's independence of judgment, given that the preparation of this case has been handled by a party, Gringotts Bank, with a documented financial and institutional interest in discrediting the ministry and specific senior wizarding figures. There it was. The credibility argument. Not from Dumbledore directly, from his chosen position, routed through the ministry's solicitor, plausibly deniable. Harry had read this coming in Lucius Malfoy's letter 3 days ago. He kept his face still. Bones looked at Donahue over her monocle. Are you suggesting that the documentation submitted by Gringotts is fabricated? A beat. No. Are you suggesting that the charter provision itself is inapplicable? No. Then I'm not sure what relevance your institutional interest argument has to the question of whether this individual received a trial, Bones said, and there was something in her tone that was the verbal equivalent of closing a door firmly. We'll move on. Donahue moved on. Harry breathed out slowly and said nothing. The session broke at midday for an hour. Harry was taken to a small anteroom with Ragnarok and Shacklebolt, who had been present throughout in his capacity as Bones' assigned Auror and who came in now carrying 3 cups of tea with the ease of someone who decided tea was the correct response to most situations. You did well, Shacklebolt said, handing Harry a cup. He's going to make another move, Harry said. Dumbledore. He wasn't here this morning, which means he's been somewhere else doing something, and whatever it was will arrive this afternoon. Shacklebolt looked at him with the same recalibrating expression Harry had now received from enough adults to recognize as its own category. You think he's had time to respond to this morning's proceedings? He has people here, Harry said. Not the observer benches, someone in the administrative staff or the court clerk's office. He knows exactly what was said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The question is what he does with it. He requested a respondent appearance, Ragnarok said. Both Harry and Shacklebolt looked at him. This morning, while we were in session, Ragnarok said. He filed a request to appear as a respondent witness. On the ministry's behalf, technically. But in practice, he's coming in this afternoon, Harry said. Shacklebolt set down his tea. Bones can deny the request. She won't, Harry said. Because denying it lets him argue procedural unfairness afterward. She'll admit him and manage the session. He thought for a moment. Actually, that might be what we want. Because if he appears, he has to answer questions. It's not just him making a statement. Bones and the Aurors can ask him things. Shacklebolt looked at Ragnarok. Can we submit additional questions through the panel? The petitioner can submit written questions for the panel's consideration, Ragnarok said. The panel decides whether to ask them. Harry pulled out a piece of parchment. Dumbledore came in at 2 o'clock with the particular quality of a person who had never in their life entered a room without being the most important person in it. He was tall and white-haired and wore deep blue robes with a quiet magnificence that managed to seem both formal and unpretentious. His half-moon spectacles caught the light. His expression was exactly what Narcissa had described, concerned, gentle, weighted with the specific gravity of a person carrying difficult truths they would rather not have to share. He was very, very good. Harry watched him walk to the witness chair from across the room and thought about Narcissa's voice saying he will make it sound reasonable and loving and enormously sad. Dumbledore sat. He acknowledged the panel. He turned his head slightly, and his gaze found Harry, and the expression on his face was so precisely calibrated, grief and recognition and something that managed to look like affection, that Harry felt the edge of it even from 20 feet away. It was not comfortable. Narcissa had said part of it might even be true, and sitting in this room, Harry believed it. Some part of Albus Dumbledore probably did feel something genuine when he looked at him. The child of two people he'd known. The walking consequence of his decisions. That didn't change what the decisions had been. Harry looked back at him and kept his face politely neutral. Professor Dumbledore, Bones said, you have been admitted as a respondent witness at the ministry's request. I want to be clear about the parameters of your appearance. You are here to address questions from this panel relating to the circumstances of Sirius Black's arrest and subsequent imprisonment, specifically as they relate to the Charter Review petition. You are not here to address the separate matter of the Treaty Council filing, which is outside this panel's purview. Is that understood? Entirely, Dumbledore said. His voice was warm and resonant and exactly what you expected. I want to say, before we begin, that I welcome this opportunity. I have always believed that when difficult decisions are made in difficult circumstances, the best response to scrutiny is openness. I have nothing to conceal. He said it without any detectable irony. Thank you, Bones said, in a tone that acknowledged the statement without endorsing it. In November 1981, you were among the first wizards on the scene of the event that led to Sirius Black's arrest. Is that correct? I arrived approximately 2 hours after the initial aura response, Dumbledore said. I was not on the scene at the time of the arrest itself. When you arrived, what was the state of the investigation? It appeared conclusive, Dumbledore said. There were 12 Muggle casualties, clear evidence of a powerful dark curse, and Black in ministry custody. The physical evidence at the scene was consistent with what Black had done. What Black was alleged to have done, Webb said. A brief pause. Yes. Alleged. Of course. Were you involved in the decision to detain Black in Azkaban without trial? Dragici asked. The decision was made by the Minister for Magic under emergency provisions, Dumbledore said. I was consulted, as I was consulted on many matters during that period. I gave my assessment. And your assessment was? Dumbledore looked at the panel with that weighted expression. My assessment was that Sirius Black was almost certainly guilty, that the evidence was sufficient, and that the political climate at the time of a possible trial would have been extremely difficult. There was a great deal of public emotion. I expressed concern about whether a fair trial could be conducted in that atmosphere. So you recommended against a trial, Dragici said. Another very brief pause. I expressed concerns about the feasibility of a fair trial at that time. I did not recommend permanent detention without review. He paused. I should have ensured a proper process was followed. That is a failure I carry. He said it beautifully. Genuine remorse, genuine accountability, but accountability for the mild failure of not following up, not for the active decision. The difference was enormous, and he delivered it so smoothly that half the room probably didn't feel the shape of it. Bones looked down at her folder. Harry recognized the movement. She was checking whether his written questions had been included. They had. He'd seen her mark them during the break. Professor Dumbledore, she said, when you assessed the evidence at the scene, were you aware of Peter Pettigrew's abilities as an animagus? The room changed. It was subtle, a change in pressure more than anything visible. Dumbledore's expression didn't shift, which was itself the tell, because it should have shifted, even slightly, in a person who was genuinely surprised by the question. Instead it stayed precisely where it was for a half-second too long before moving into thoughtful consideration. I'm not sure I follow the relevance, he began. It's a simple factual question, Bones said. Were you aware that Peter Pettigrew was an unregistered animagus? I had suspicions, Dumbledore said, that were never confirmed. What was his animagus form, to the best of your knowledge? I believe, a rat. A rat, Bones said. And is it your position that when you assessed the scene, where the physical evidence of Pettigrew's death consisted of a single finger, the possibility that a man whose unregistered animagus form was a small animal capable of self-mutilation and escape did not occur to you as relevant? The room was very, very still. Dumbledore stopped. The emotional intensity of the situation, yes or no, Professor? Did it occur to you? The silence that followed was not long, but it had weight. It occurred to me as a possibility, Dumbledore said quietly. And did you raise it with the investigating aurors? Another silence. No, he said. I did not. Harry heard the shift in the room, not a sound, exactly, but the absence of one. The specific silence of 14 people deciding to update their understanding of a situation. On the benches, Griselda Marchbanks had leaned slightly forward. Tiberius Ogden was looking at Dumbledore in a way that was quite different from how he'd been looking at him before. The session continued for another 90 minutes. Donahue interjected twice. Dumbledore recovered his composure and managed the rest of his testimony with precision and care. He was too skilled to unravel completely from one exchange, and Harry hadn't expected him to. But the animagus moment sat in the room like an object that had been placed on a table and couldn't be removed. Every subsequent statement Dumbledore made was heard through it. At 4:30, Bones called the session to a close. This panel will issue its determination within 10 days, she said. The question before us is whether there is sufficient basis for a full mandatory review hearing, which would include a complete examination of the original evidence and the summoning of any available witnesses. We will communicate our determination in writing to all parties. She closed her folder. We are adjourned. The room began to move. Harry stayed in his seat for a moment, not because he had anything specific to do there but because he needed a breath that wasn't performance before he stood up. He became aware of Dumbledore standing beside him. He'd crossed the room quietly. Now he stood at the edge of Harry's peripheral vision, not quite in front, not quite beside, and his voice when he spoke was very quiet, below the ambient noise of the room rearranging itself around the end of the session. Harry, he said. Harry looked up at him. He'd thought about this moment, had thought about it since Narcissa's warning, had prepared for it, but preparation and reality were different rooms and now he was in the real one. Dumbledore was tall, and from Harry's seated position he was very tall, and the half-moon spectacles caught the light in a way that made his eyes hard to read. "You look like your father," Dumbledore said. "The eyes are your mother's." "I know," Harry said. "I want you to understand," Dumbledore began. "I don't need you to explain anything right now," Harry said quietly. Not rudely, his voice was even. "I think this is the wrong place and the wrong time for that conversation, and I think you know that. I think you're trying to have it anyway because you'd rather manage how I feel about you than leave it to the evidence." A pause. "You are remarkably perceptive," Dumbledore said. "I had a lot of help," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The grief in his expression was real, Harry could see that, and Narcissa had been right that part of it was probably genuine. The remorse was real. The affection was possibly real. None of it changed what had been done. "I made decisions that I believed were necessary," Dumbledore said. "For the greater good." "I know that, Professor Dumbledore." Ragnarok had appeared at Harry's shoulder, materializing with the silent efficiency he'd apparently practiced into an art form. "I believe this conversation requires the presence of legal counsel, which means it should be scheduled properly. We'd be happy to arrange a formal meeting." Dumbledore looked at Ragnarok. Something passed through his expression, not anger, but something in the same family as it. Then it was gone. He looked back at Harry. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me." He inclined his head and moved away. Harry watched him go. "You all right?" Ragnarok said, which was as close as Ragnarok ever got to asking how you were feeling. "Yes," Harry said. He was trying to establish an emotional connection that would complicate your future testimony, Ragnarok said. "I know." Harry stood up. The chair scraped back on the stone floor. "He knows about the treaty filing. He knows about the financial audit. He knows we have everything." He looked at the door through which Dumbledore had left. "That wasn't about managing the hearing. That was about seeing whether he could still." He stopped. "Bend the needle," Ragnarok said. "Yes." Harry picked up his jacket. "Come on. I want to talk to Marchbanks before she leaves." Griselda Marchbanks was 93 years old and had the posture of someone who considered physical decline a personal affront. She had been the head examiner for the ordinary wizarding level examinations for 40 years before moving to the Wisengamot, and she wore authority the way someone else wore a familiar coat, not as a statement, just as a thing she'd had for long enough that it had become part of her. She was talking to Ogden near the observer bench exit, but when Harry approached she turned immediately, with the swiftness of someone who had been watching him throughout the session and had been waiting to see whether he'd come to her. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Madam Marchbanks," Harry said. "I wanted to introduce myself properly, since we didn't have the opportunity before the session." "You wanted to see what you were dealing with," she said. Harry allowed himself a slight smile. "That too." She studied him with the sharp, direct attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating students under pressure and had no patience for anything less than actual capability. "You prepared well." The enigma's question was decisive. "It would have come out in a full hearing," Harry said. "I wanted it on record before the panel's deliberation." She looked at him for a moment. "You understand that what happens after this, if they grant the full review, if Black is exonerated, that's the smaller part of what you've started." "Yes," Harry said. "I know. The treaty filing. The financial audit." She said each one precisely. "You are building toward something larger." "I'm building toward accountability," Harry said. "For what was done to me specifically, and for the broader pattern it represents." He paused. "I'm not trying to bring down the institution. I'm not trying to," he stopped. Found the right word. "I'm trying to establish that the law applies to everyone. That's it. That's the whole thing. Ogden had been listening with his hands clasped in front of him and an expression of careful assessment. Now he said, Dumbledore has done extraordinary things. He is not, I know, Harry said. He's not simply a villain. He's a person who did extraordinary good and also did something unconscionable, and the first thing doesn't make the second thing acceptable. He looked at Ogden steadily. I'm not asking you to hate him. I'm asking you to apply the same standard to him that you'd apply to anyone else. Ogden was quiet for a moment. That, Marchbank said, is a very grown-up thing to ask. I've had to grow up fairly fast, Harry said. She looked at him for another moment with those sharp eyes. Then she said, come and see me. Properly. Not at the ministry, I have a house in Hogsmeade. Bring your documentation. She said it the way she probably said everything, as if it had already happened and she was simply informing him of the fact. There are things that need to be done that require Wizengamot members, and there are members who will listen to evidence that is properly presented. Thank you, Harry said. Don't thank me yet. She buttoned her outer robe with brisk efficiency. It's going to be a very unpleasant political season and I am well past the age of enjoying those. She moved toward the exit, then glanced back. The letter you wrote to Black. He received it. Harry went still. How do you? I have been a senior Wizengamot member for 40 years, Marchbank said. I have connections in a great many places. She looked at him. He didn't read it. He can't, yet, Azkaban does what it does. But someone is keeping it for him. A very brief pause. I thought you should know it arrived. She left. Harry stood in the emptying room and breathed. The panel's determination came on the 8th day, not the 10th, which meant Bones had made up her mind faster than the statutory period required. It was 2 pages. The first page established the legal basis and summarized the evidence presented. The second page contained the determination, which was, full mandatory review hearing granted. The hearing was to be scheduled within 45 days. The full evidentiary record, including the Gringotts documentation, was admitted as relevant context. Peter Pettigrew's possible survival was to be investigated as a priority matter before the hearing date, with the DMLE assigned to conduct the investigation. At the bottom of the determination, a note in Bones' handwriting, the panel further recommends that Sirius Black be transferred from Azkaban to Ministry medical custody for the duration of the pre-hearing period, for assessment of fitness to participate in proceedings. This recommendation is issued under Charter Article 9, subsection 4. Charter Article 9, subsection 4. Harry had read that article. The transfer recommendation, once issued by a panel under Charter authority, was not optional, it had to be implemented within 14 days or the Ministry faced a treaty violation. Ragnarok read the determination over Harry's shoulder and then stood quietly for a moment. She gave us the transfer, Harry said. She did. He'll be out of Azkaban in 2 weeks. In Ministry custody, Ragnarok said. Not free. But, out of Azkaban, Harry said. That's the first thing. The transfer happened on a grey Wednesday morning, and Harry wasn't there for it because legally there was no reason for him to be and practically there was no benefit to him being present. He knew it was happening because Shacklebolt had told Ragnarok and Ragnarok had told him, and he spent the morning in his study not quite able to focus on the books in front of him. It was Shacklebolt who came in the afternoon and told him how it had gone. He walked out under his own power, Shacklebolt said, sitting down across from Harry at the study table. Which, after 6 years, a lot of people wouldn't have managed. He's thin and he hasn't spoken yet, but he looked at the sky when they brought him out. He paused. Just stood there for about a minute, looking up. Before they moved him. Harry said nothing. He's at St. Mungo's, Shacklebolt said. Healers are with him. It'll be weeks before he's in any condition to participate in the hearing, which is why Bones pushed for the early transfer. Harry nodded. There's something else, Shacklebolt said. He reached into his robe and put something on the table. It was an envelope, and Harry recognized it immediately, his own handwriting, the letter he'd sent through Ragnarok's channel to Azkaban. He looked at Shacklebolt. "They found it in his cell when they processed his transfer," Shacklebolt said. "Someone did deliver it. He couldn't read it, like Marchbank said, but he'd kept it under the mattress." He paused. "The healer who processed the transfer gave it to me. Said he was holding it when they brought him out." Another pause, shorter. "When they asked him to let go so they could do the medical exam, he wouldn't. They had to let him keep it." Harry looked at his own envelope on the table. He thought about a man who hadn't been able to read it but had held it anyway. Who had walked out under his own power and looked at the sky. He thought about compass needles and bent things and what happened when you took the force off and let them point toward true north. "When he's well enough," Harry said, "I'd like to meet him." "I know," Shacklebolt said. "He's already asking about you. Through the healers, he can't talk properly yet, but he's asking. About whether you're all right." Harry stared at him. "You," Shacklebolt said, with a slight softness in his voice that he didn't bother to conceal. "He's worried about you." Harry looked away at the enchanted window with its highland sky, which today was low and grey and moving, clouds crossing it fast, and underneath the clouds the mountain steady and unchanged, and he thought that was probably the right order of things, sky moving, mountain still, and held on to the steadiness of it until the complicated feeling in his chest resolved into something he could sit with. "Tell the healers he doesn't need to worry," Harry said. "Tell him I'm fine." He was. 2 weeks later, Sirius Black sat up in a hospital bed at St. Mungo's and read a letter from a 7-year-old boy and laughed. Not the hollow laugh from the arrest scene that had been used against him for 6 years. Something different. Warmer. The laugh of someone who had been in the dark for a very long time and had just understood that there was a door. Harry wasn't there to hear it. But Shacklebolt was, and Shacklebolt told him, and that was enough. The hearing was 41 days out. Harry opened the next book in his stack and started reading. The trial, the real one, the full mandatory review hearing, happened on a bright October morning when Harry was still 7, the leaves outside the ministry atrium turning in the thin sunlight through the high enchanted windows, and the hearing room on the 3rd floor was fuller than it had been for the preliminary, fuller than it had been for anything in recent memory according to Marchbanks, who had said this to Ragnarok with the tone of someone who found human behavior endlessly predictable. Sirius Black entered the room under his own power, flanked by 2 healers, thin still but upright. He'd had 6 weeks in St. Mungo's and he wasn't healed. 6 years in Azkaban didn't unhappen in 6 weeks, but he was present. He was there, in the room, with his dark eyes clear and his jaw set and the particular bearing of someone who had decided that whatever happened next, they were going to meet it standing up. He looked at Harry as he came in. Harry looked back at him. They hadn't met yet, the healers had recommended against it until the hearing, wanting Sirius's emotional state to be as stable as possible for the proceedings. This was their first actual meeting. 7 years old and the person who should have been raising him, separated by a room full of people. Sirius Black looked at him for a long moment. His expression moved through several things too quickly to catch individually and then settled into something that was complicated and real and didn't need naming. Harry nodded. Just once. Something in Sirius's face loosened. He sat down. The hearing took 4 hours. Peter Pettigrew was not produced. The DMLE investigation had turned up evidence of his survival but not his location, and his file had been formally reopened as a fugitive case, which was itself significant because it meant the ministry was officially acknowledging that Pettigrew might not be dead, which was the entire foundation of the case against Sirius. The evidence review was systematic and devastating. Every gap in the original investigation. Every assumption made without testing. Every procedural failure. Webb and Dragici had done their work thoroughly in the 6 weeks between the preliminary and the hearing, and what they presented was not a dramatic case of conspiracy but something quieter and more effective, a case that had never actually been built, only assumed. Donahue was professional and prepared and outmatched, because the thing he'd been asked to defend was not defensible under the evidentiary standard the charter required. Dumbledore was present this time, in the observer seats, watching. He didn't attempt to speak. He was too skilled to make that error again. Sirius testified. It was brief and it was precise, and it was the account of a man who had been carrying the truth for 6 years with no one to say it to, and who was now saying it to a room full of people who were, for the first time, legally required to listen. He'd been the Potter's secret keeper, he said. He'd given that role to Pettigrew. He'd trusted the wrong person in the last moment of a war, and he'd been paying for it ever since. The panel deliberated for 40 minutes. The determination was read aloud by Amelia Bones in a voice that was exactly as steady as her face, which was to say, completely. Not guilty. Wrongful imprisonment confirmed. Immediate and unconditional release ordered. Ministry of Magic ordered to appear before the Wisengamot to address procedural failures in the original detention. The room erupted. Not in the way films made you think rooms erupted. There was no cheering, no applause. It was a roar of voices, multiple conversations starting simultaneously, the specific noise of an institution being shaken by something it hadn't expected to feel. Marchbank stood and said something to Ogden. Shacklebolt was writing the quick quotes, which was either having a personal crisis or the best professional day of her life. In the center of it, Sirius Black sat very still for approximately 5 seconds. Then he put his face in his hands. Harry got up from his seat and crossed the room. He sat down in the empty chair beside Sirius and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment didn't already contain. After a moment, Sirius lifted his face from his hands and looked at him, and his eyes were red and his expression was the raw, unguarded thing that people looked like when they'd stopped performing for an audience because they'd stopped caring about the audience. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. His voice was rough still, not fully recovered. "I get that a lot," Harry said. Sirius laughed. It came out a little broken at the edges, but it was real, and it was warm, and it was the laugh of someone who had come back to themselves from a very long way away. "James would have found this whole situation completely insane," he said. "I know," Harry said. A pause. "Your mum would have organized it better." "I tried," Harry said. Another laugh. More complete this time. Sirius reached out and put his hand briefly on the top of Harry's head, the way you did with a child you'd known when they were small and in your mind they were still that size regardless of what they'd become. The room was still loud around them. Dumbledore was leaving through the side door, and Harry watched him go, calm, composed, managing his exit, and thought, not yet. But the framework is built and the precedent is set and the evidence is in the permanent record and every subsequent proceeding will reference today. Not yet. But the door was open. What happens now? Sirius said. Harry thought about the Treaty Council filing. About the financial audit package sitting in Bones' secondary files, waiting. About Marchbank's house in Hogsmeade and the Wisengamot members who would listen to evidence properly presented. About a Horcrux the Cursebreakers were still analyzing and Voldemort moving at the edges of things like weather before a storm. Now, Harry said, we do the second thing. Chapter 5, The Return 2 years passed. Not quietly, nothing about Harry's life was quiet anymore, and he'd made his peace with that, but productively. He spent those 2 years the way a person spent time when they finally had enough of it, reading everything, meeting everyone worth meeting, and building the kind of quiet, unshowy competence that people who were paying attention would notice and people who weren't would underestimate. He lived at Gringotts until he was 8, and then in a small house in Hogsmeade that the Potter estate owned and that had sat empty since 1981 waiting for someone to come back to it. Sirius had come with him, once the healers cleared him for independent living, which took 8 months longer than Sirius wanted and approximately the right amount of time by everyone else's estimation. The house was narrow and slightly tilted in the way of old magical buildings and smelled of old wood and the specific mustiness of rooms that had been magically preserved rather than lived in. They aired it out, replaced the furniture that had given up, and made it functional. Sirius was complicated. Harry had known he would be. 6 years in Azkaban didn't produce a straightforward person on the other side, and Sirius Black hadn't been entirely straightforward to begin with. He had bad nights. He had days when he was brilliant company and days when he sat in the kitchen at 2 a.m. staring at nothing, and Harry had learned to read the difference and respond accordingly: tea for the bad nights, space for the very bad ones, and the kind of steady, undemanding presence that asked nothing and offered everything. In return, Sirius taught him things. Not formally. Not in the way Ragnarok's selected books or Marchbank's measured guidance operated. Sirius taught him the way someone taught when they'd spent 6 years being unable to teach anyone anything, with the slightly desperate generosity of a person who'd been storing things up with nowhere to put them. He taught him to fly, in a field outside Hogsmeade on a borrowed school broom, and Harry turned out to be so naturally gifted that Sirius had sat on the ground laughing for about 3 minutes before he could provide useful instruction. He taught him dueling theory, because Sirius had been one of the best in his year at Hogwarts and theory was something he could give without needing to be fully physically recovered. He told him about James and Lily, not the sanitized versions, not the myth, but the real people, with their specific humor and their specific arguments and the exact way James's hair did that thing and Lily's laugh was always slightly too loud for the room. These stories were the best thing Harry had ever received. He was almost 9 when the Hogwarts letter arrived. It arrived on a Thursday in late July, carried by a school owl that clearly considered its job beneath it, and Harry set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before opening it. Sirius was watching from across the table with a mug of tea and the specific expression he wore when he had opinions and was choosing whether to share them. "Say it," Harry said. "I didn't say anything." "You're making the face." Sirius made a slightly different face. "It's just a letter." "It's the letter," Harry said. "You know it is." "It doesn't have to be anything you don't want it to be," Sirius said. "That's the point, isn't it? That's what the last 2 years have been about." "Yes," Harry said. "But Hogwarts is where he is. And Hogwarts is where Voldemort will eventually come." He looked at the letter. "Avoiding it doesn't help anyone. Going in unprepared doesn't either." "I'm not unprepared," Harry said. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. At the 9-year-old across the table who had, in the last 2 years, learned enough magic under Sirius's informal instruction and his own relentless self-directed study to worry at least 2 qualified wizards who'd tested him and who couldn't quite decide whether to be impressed or concerned. Who had Ragnarok's precision and Marchbank's strategic patience and something that was purely his own, a kind of quiet, assured intelligence that didn't need to announce itself. "No," Sirius said. "You're not." Harry opened the letter. It was standard, the list of required books and equipment, the term dates, the instructions for the Hogwarts Express. Standard except for one thing, a second sheet, folded separately, on Hogwarts official parchment and signed by Albus Dumbledore. Harry read it without expression. "Dear Harry, I understand this letter may feel complicated given recent events. I want you to know that Hogwarts remains what it has always been, a place of learning, of safety, and of community. I look forward to the opportunity to speak with you properly when you arrive. There are things I owe you, not least of which is an honest conversation. A.D. Harry folded both letters. He looked at Sirius. "He wants to talk," Harry said. "He's been wanting to talk since the hearing," Sirius said. "Every time he's tried, Ragnarok's shut it down." "I know." Harry stood up. "But I'm 9 now, and Ragnarok isn't coming to Hogwarts with me, and Dumbledore controls the school." He thought for a moment. "Which means I need to have that conversation eventually, and I need to have it on my terms." "And what are your terms?" Harry picked up the letters. "I'll know them when I need them." Sirius watched him leave the kitchen and said nothing, which was how Harry knew he was worried. He didn't go through the standard arrangement of being sorted with the first years. That had been part of the goblin negotiated provision that had allowed him to start Hogwarts 2 years early, not with his age cohort, because his age cohort was 11 and he was 9, but under a special independent student designation that Marchbanks had pushed through the Hogwarts Board of Governors over 3 months of sustained political argument. The provision allowed for independent study tracks at Hogwarts for students of exceptional ability and unusual circumstances, a clause that had been in the school's founding charter and hadn't been invoked in 60 years. It meant he wouldn't be sorted. It meant he had a room of his own rather than a dormitory. It meant his schedule was partially bespoke, mixing standard classes with independent work and direct mentorship sessions with specific professors. And it meant that his presence at Hogwarts was, technically, not under Dumbledore's authority but under the Board of Governors' authority, which was a distinction that mattered. Dumbledore knew it mattered. Harry knew Dumbledore knew. The Hogwarts Express was its own experience. Harry found a compartment and settled in with a book and the ward stone in his pocket. He still carried it, always, a habit that had become so ingrained it felt like carrying his keys, and the train was barely out of King's Cross when the compartment door slid open. A boy with white blonde hair and the careful posture of someone who'd been told to stand up straight so many times it had become automatic looked in at him. Behind him were 2 larger boys who had the specific function of furniture that occasionally walked. "Harry Potter," the boy said. "Not a question." Harry looked up from his book. "Draco Malfoy," he said, equally without inflection. Draco blinked. He'd clearly prepared an entrance and hadn't accounted for Harry knowing who he was before being introduced. He recovered smoothly. He was his mother's son in that, at least. "You know me. Your mother and I have met," Harry said. Another blink. The furniture boys looked at each other. Draco processed this for a moment and then, apparently deciding that his prepared entrance was unsalvageable and pivoting was the better option, said, "Can I sit?" Harry looked at him. Then at the furniture boys. "Just you." Draco glanced back at Crabbe and Goyle, for that was clearly what they were, and said, "Wait outside," with the practiced authority of someone who'd been issuing this instruction since he could talk. They withdrew. Draco sat. For a moment they just looked at each other, the 9-year-old who had spent 2 years rebuilding himself from scratch and the 10-year-old who was still entirely what other people had built him to be, though not, Harry thought, irretrievably. "My mother said I should talk to you if I got the chance," Draco said. He said it with the slight stiffness of someone reciting rather than speaking, and then seemed to hear it himself and relaxed marginally. "She didn't tell me what to say." "What do you want to say?" Harry said. Draco looked out the window at the countryside moving past. "I've heard a lot of things about you," he said. "Some from my father and some from my mother and they're different." "The things?" He paused. "My father thinks you're dangerous. My mother thinks you're—" He stopped. "She didn't say exactly what she thinks. She just said I should talk to you before I decided what to think." "That's good advice," Harry said. "She's usually right," Draco said, and there was something in the way he said it that was entirely unguarded, just a fact he hadn't bothered to perform around, and Harry thought, there you are. The actual person, underneath the architecture. "What do you want from Hogwarts?" Harry asked. Draco looked at him. It was clearly not the question he'd expected. "What?" "Not what your father wants. Not the expectations. What do you want?" Draco opened his mouth and then closed it. "Then, I want to be good at it," he said, with a simplicity that surprised them both, apparently including him. "I want to, actually know things. Not just, perform knowing things." "Then we might get along," Harry said, and opened his book again, which was as clear an invitation to continue or leave as Draco was going to get. Draco stayed. He didn't speak much, but he stayed. When the train arrived at Hogsmeade Station and they climbed out into the cool September air and the smell of the lake and the first sight of the castle lit against the darkening sky, Harry stopped for a moment and looked at it. He'd read about it. He'd studied its magical foundations through goblin archival records, understood its ward structure, knew its history back to the founders. He was as prepared for it as a person could be. It was still extraordinary. First time? Draco said beside him. First time, Harry said. The castle looked back at them, ancient and indifferent and enormous, and somewhere inside it the second thing was waiting. Dumbledore's office was on the 7th floor, and Dumbledore did not summon Harry to it immediately, which was itself a kind of message, giving Harry time to arrive, settle, adjust, before opening that particular conversation. Harry understood this as strategy and also, possibly, as genuine consideration. With Dumbledore, the two were rarely separable. He spent his first 2 weeks learning the school's rhythms. His independent status meant he moved differently through it than regular students, attending some classes in full, sitting in on others as an observer by arrangement, spending mornings in the library that made the one at his primary school look like a pamphlet rack. He was not invisible. It was impossible to be invisible when you were the most famous child in the wizarding world and also 9 years old and also occupying a status that had the staff alternately uncertain and curious. But he was quiet, and he was consistent, and within a week people had mostly incorporated him into their mental map of the school. The students were more complicated. He wasn't in a house, which meant he had no automatic community and no automatic rivals. This was lonely in some moments and freeing in others. He ate at whatever table had space, which turned out to be an excellent way to meet people, because no one quite knew what to make of a 9-year-old with no house affiliation who sat down across from you like he'd been there before. He met Hermione Granger at the Gryffindor table on his 4th day, which was not the last time he would be grateful for the seating arrangement. She was 10 and had arrived at Hogwarts as part of the standard intake and had clearly been managing the experience by reading every available source material, which was an approach Harry found immediately compatible with his own. "You're Harry Potter," she said, when he sat down. "Yes. I've read everything I could find about you," she said. "Which isn't much that's reliable. Most of it is mythology rather than biography." "Most of it is wrong," Harry confirmed. "I thought so." She had a book open beside her plate and a slightly focused expression that suggested the conversation was interesting, but she was tracking several things simultaneously. "Are you really doing independent study? Not in a house?" "Yes." "Is that by choice?" "Mostly." She looked at him. "What are you actually studying?" And that was how that started. He met Ron Weasley by accident 2 days after that, when they both reached for the same book in the library at the same time, and the resulting negotiation about who needed it more lasted long enough to become a conversation. Ron was funny in a way that was genuine rather than performed, quick observations, self-aware about his own gaps, refreshingly unbothered by the things he didn't know while being genuinely interested in fixing that. He also, Harry discovered, had an instinctive strategic intelligence that showed itself most clearly in chess but wasn't limited to it. "You think about things like they're puzzles," Ron said, 3 weeks in, watching Harry work through a problem at a library table. "Most things are puzzles," Harry said. "Yeah, but you see the whole board." Ron frowned. "Most people only see the piece in front of them." Harry looked at him. "You do too. With chess." Ron shrugged. "Chess is easy. It's everything else that's," he made a gesture. "Practice," Harry said. "It's just practice." Ron looked skeptical, but he came back to the library the next day. The summons to Dumbledore's office came in the 4th week, delivered by a school owl that found Harry in the middle of Transfiguration. Professor McGonagall, who was the most consistently interesting teacher he'd encountered and who had been watching him with the contained satisfaction of someone discovering that a long-held theory was correct, paused mid-explanation when the owl arrived and looked at Harry with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally concerned. "You don't have to go," she said, after the class had shifted to independent practice and she'd come to stand beside his workbench, quietly enough that no one else could hear. Harry looked up at her. McGonagall was, in his assessment, one of the 2 or 3 genuinely trustworthy adults at Hogwarts, and she'd been watching him with that careful contained regard since the first day. She'd been close to his parents. She'd been at Hogwarts when all of it happened. She had opinions about what had been done that she hadn't said to him directly, but that lived clearly in the particular quality of her attention. "I do, eventually," Harry said. "Better on my schedule than his." She looked at him for a moment. "Be careful," she said. "I will." "That isn't," she stopped. Started again. "He cares about you, Harry. I want you to understand that. He always has, in his way. It doesn't make what was done acceptable. But it means he is not simply performing care, and knowing that matters when you're in the room with him." Harry thought about the hearing. About standing in that high-ceilinged room with Dumbledore's voice saying "I believe he was almost certainly guilty," and the specific quality of his regret when the animagus question landed. "I know," Harry said. "That's what makes it complicated." She touched his shoulder once, briefly, and went back to the front of the room. Dumbledore's office was circular, which Harry had expected, and warm with firelight and the smell of old books and something indefinably comfortable that was probably partially natural and partially very carefully constructed. The portraits on the walls were awake, former headmasters watching with varying degrees of discretion. The silver instruments on the shelves were turning softly. Fawkes was on his perch, regarding Harry with one bright eye. Dumbledore was behind his desk, and he stood when Harry came in, which was a choice, not a required gesture, not protocol, just a person choosing to stand for someone entering their office. "Harry," he said. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for waiting until I was settled," Harry said. He sat in the chair across from the desk without being invited. He'd thought about this, the sitting. Whether to wait. Whether waiting was appropriate deference or strategic weakness. He'd decided that sitting when he wanted to sit was a better foundation for this conversation than performing any particular posture. Dumbledore sat. He looked at Harry with the same weighted expression as always, but there was something slightly different about it now, something that had shifted since the hearing. A quality that Harry would eventually identify as the expression of a person who was no longer managing a situation but was simply in it. "I've wanted to talk to you for 2 years, Dumbledore said. "I know," Harry said. "I wasn't ready to listen for 2 years. I am now, mostly." "Mostly," Dumbledore said. "I'm 9, Harry said. Entirely ready is probably a reasonable thing to wait for." Something in Dumbledore's expression moved toward a smile and then reconsidered. "Fair," he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his own hands on the desk. "I want to begin by saying something I have not said directly to you, though I have said versions of it to other people in other contexts, which is not the same thing and I know it isn't." He looked up. "What was done to you was wrong. The enchantments. The placement. The financial management. All of it. It was wrong, and I did it, and no argument about necessity or the greater good or the complexity of wartime decisions changes the fundamental fact of the wrongness." Harry looked at him. He'd expected something more evasive. Something more elegantly qualified. The directness was, he processed it, checked it, looked for the angle. Because there was always an angle with Dumbledore, not because he was dishonest but because he thought in structures and every statement served a function in the larger design. The function of this one, Harry decided, was genuineness. It was actually meant. Which didn't mean it wasn't also strategic. Being genuine was always strategic with someone who was paying attention, but it was genuine first. "I know you mean that," Harry said. "But?" Dumbledore said. "But meaning it doesn't make us even," Harry said. "And meaning it doesn't change the fact that you still have decisions to make about how you run this school and how you pursue what you think needs pursuing, and some of those decisions will still involve me whether you mean well or not." He paused. "So the apology matters, and it's received, and it doesn't resolve anything by itself." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "You sound like your mother," he said. She had exactly that quality of saying the honest thing in the exact words it needed to be said in. No more and no less. Harry felt the specific complicated thing he always felt when someone talked about his parents. Not grief, exactly, you couldn't grieve people you'd never known. Something adjacent to it, with different edges. Tell me about her, he said. And Dumbledore did. For 20 minutes, without an agenda, without framing, without the weight of anything except memory, Albus Dumbledore talked about Lily Evans Potter, her absolute refusal to be categorized, her extraordinary magical gifts, the specific quality of her laughter, the way she'd argued with James in the early days with the fierceness of someone who was trying very hard not to admire him yet. He talked about her kindness that was never soft, her intelligence that was never cold. He talked about the specific day, standing outside a Hogsmeade pub, that he'd looked at her and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she would be one of the people who changed things. That she was that rare person who altered the atmosphere of a room by existing in it. He talked about her death with a grief that was entirely unperformed. Harry listened. When it was over, the office was quiet except for the soft turns of the silver instruments and Fawkes's occasional adjustment on his perch. She deserved better from you, Harry said quietly. Her kid deserved better. Yes, Dumbledore said. Are you going to keep making decisions about my life without my consent? No, Dumbledore said. I am going to try extremely hard not to. I won't promise perfection because I am aware of my own tendencies and I think promising perfection to you specifically would be an insult to your intelligence. Harry almost smiled at that. Almost. I'm going to know when you're doing it, he said. Even if you think I don't. I rather expected that, Dumbledore said. Good. Harry stood. The Treaty Council filing. The financial audit. Those proceedings continue independently of anything that happens here. You know that. I know. This conversation doesn't affect those proceedings. Nothing that happens at Hogwarts does. They're on their own track. I understand. Dumbledore looked at him. Harry, may I ask what you want from being at Hogwarts? Not for the legal case. For yourself. Harry thought about that. I want to learn things, he said. Properly. With other people. I want to be a student, just a student, for however long that's possible before everything else makes it complicated. He paused. And I want to understand Voldemort well enough to stop him. Not because of a prophecy or because I was designated as the one who has to do it. But because I understand things better than most people about what he is and what created him, and that understanding is worth something. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, you know about the prophecy. I know about it, Harry said. I've read the original record. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. A prophecy is a possible future, not a mandate. I'm choosing to engage with it on my own terms. And those terms? Not decided yet, Harry said. I'll let you know. He left. Walking back down the spiral staircase from the headmaster's office, Harry felt the school around him, its weight and its age and its particular living magic, the wards in the walls and the staircases that moved and the portraits that watched and the 7 centuries of accumulated human experience baked into the stone. He felt it the way he felt everything now, since the cleansing, fully, without the dampening layers, the whole frequency of it. He also felt, 3 floors below him and to the east, something that made him stop on the staircase for a moment. Something dark. Not a person or a creature or anything he could specify. More like, a temperature. A cold spot in the school's warm magical frequency. There and then gone, like a candle draft. He stood still for a moment. Then he continued down the stairs and went to find Hermione, because Hermione had been researching the school's magical foundation records from the library's restricted section and he wanted to know if she'd found anything anomalous. She had. There's something in the castle, she said, when he sat across from her in the library and she slid a parchment across the table at him. I found it 3 days ago and I've been trying to verify before I said anything. Look at this. The parchment was covered in her handwriting, dense and organized, cross-referenced with margin notes in a different ink. He read through it. It was a record of the school's annual magical audit, a procedural thing done every decade to verify the integrity of the wards and structures. The most recent audit was 3 years old, and in it, buried in the technical notation about the third-floor corridor east wing, was a record of a magical anomaly. Described, in the auditor's dry language, as a contained object of significant magical density, origin unclear, not consistent with standard Hogwarts ward architecture. Something's being kept here, Harry said. Something powerful, Hermione said. Something that's been moved here deliberately and hidden. The audit notes suggest it arrived within the last 6 years based on the ward integration timeline. She looked at him. 6 years is when Voldemort fell, Harry said. He looked at the parchment. He thought about the curse-breakers at Gringotts and their careful analysis of the soul tether. Their theory, which they'd given him in clinical language and which he'd turned over many times since, that Voldemort had, in his effort to evade death, fragmented his own soul and lodged pieces of it in objects. That the piece that had ended up in Harry had not been intentional, a side effect of the killing curse's rebounding. That there might be other pieces. Other objects. Hermione, he said, do you know what a Horcrux is? She stared at him. Then she closed the book she had opened beside her and opened a different one, flipping to an index with rapid, practiced efficiency. I've read the word once in a dark arts theory text. It's restricted reading and the reference is brief because the author clearly didn't want to go into detail. She found the page. It's a soul anchor. An object into which a portion of the maker's soul has been placed. It creates a form of, immortality isn't quite the right word, continued existence. As long as the object exists, the maker can't truly die. If there are multiple objects, Harry said. Then they all need to be destroyed before, she stopped. That's what's in the third-floor corridor. Probably, Harry said. Or nearby. Dumbledore moved it here for safekeeping, most likely. Which means he knows what it is. He thought about the office upstairs, about the silver instruments turning. He's been protecting it. Why? If it's Voldemort's, why not destroy it? Because destroying them is complicated, Harry said. They're designed to be. And because, he stopped, working through it. Because he might want them intact for strategic reasons. If Voldemort finds out his soul anchors are being destroyed, he might move faster, act more desperately. Dumbledore's probably trying to gather them all before acting. That's actually smart, Hermione said, with the slightly reluctant tone of someone crediting a strategy they don't entirely approve of. It is smart, Harry said. It's also dangerous, because keeping them intact means keeping the risk. And it means Voldemort, wherever he is always capable of return. Do you know where the others are? Hermione said. No. But I know someone who's been researching it. Harry stood. I need to write to Ragnarok. She looked up at him. Harry. Is this, she stopped. Are we actually talking about you-know-who being something we have to deal with? We're 9 and 10 years old. I know, Harry said. But we're 9 and 10-year-olds at the school where one of his soul anchors is being stored, and he's been trying to come back for years, and the person who has a plan for dealing with it, he paused. Has a plan that doesn't include me knowing what it is. And I have a problem with that. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened her papers. What do you need me to research, she said. The cold spot in the castle's magical frequency became a regular feature of Harry's awareness over the following weeks, a presence he'd mapped to the third-floor corridor and more specifically, when he walked it carefully and paid attention to the temperature of the magic in the walls, to a chamber beyond a locked door that had significantly more wards on it than anything else in the school. He didn't go in. He wasn't ready to go in, and more importantly, he didn't need to. Knowing where it was, what it probably was, and that Dumbledore was aware of it was enough for now. What he was more immediately concerned about was the other cold spot. This one was moving. He noticed it first in October, a barely there wrongness in the back of his awareness, like a sound at the edge of hearing. He'd learned to trust the edge of hearing things since the cleansing, because they were usually real. He noticed it in defense against the dark arts first, which was notable because Dada was the one class where wrong magic should have stood out to the teacher. The teacher was Professor Quirrell, who had a nervous disposition, a stammer that appeared and disappeared with inconsistency that told you it wasn't entirely natural, and a turban that he wore every day without exception. Harry had been in his class 3 times and had been watching him since the second one, when the coldness had intensified noticeably during a lecture on defensive theory. After the 3rd class, he found Ron in the corridor. "Quirrell," Harry said. Ron looked at him. He'd learned to read Harry's "I've noticed something" tone. "What about him?" "Something's wrong with him." "He's just nervous," Ron said. "My brothers say he used to be fine and then he went on some kind of research trip and came back weird." "Where did he go?" Harry said. "Albania, I think." Ron frowned. "Why does it?" He stopped. His face did the thing it did when he saw the board position clearly. "Harry." "Albania," Harry said. "That's where Voldemort was supposed to be, yes. Living in the forests. Not dead but not properly alive either." Harry watched Quirrell disappear around the corner at the end of the corridor. "He went to Albania for research and he came back wrong and now there's something cold in the school and the turban is," he looked at Ron. "Why does a wizard in a school need a turban?" Ron stared at him. "I need you to find out everything about what's behind that 3rd floor door," Harry said. "Not by going in. By finding out what's been moved through the school's transport records, what unusual items were brought in under Dumbledore's authorization in the last year." "How do I find that?" "Your brothers," Harry said. "Fred and George know more about this school's undocumented knowledge than any other students. Ask them." Ron looked uncertain and then decisive, which was his general arc on things. "All right." He paused. "Harry, if Voldemort is in that turban, I know. We're 9. I know. That's a lot." "I know," Harry said, and meant it, and clapped Ron on the shoulder and went to write 2 letters, one to Ragnarok about the Horcrux research, and one to Sirius, because Sirius needed to know about the turban. Sirius's response arrived in 36 hours, which was as fast as the owl could reasonably fly, and it said several things that were not appropriate for an owl letter in terms of language and one thing that was, "Do not engage with Quirrell directly. Do not let him know you've noticed. I'm coming to Hogsmeade for the weekend. Stay out of the 3rd floor corridor. I mean it, Harry." Harry wrote back, "I know. I'm being careful. He hasn't noticed me noticing. See you Saturday." He was, for the record, being careful. He was also being thorough, which was different from reckless, and he thought Sirius sometimes confused them. The care took the form of several things. He altered his behavior around Quirrell very slightly, reducing his attentiveness in class just enough to read as normal, avoiding the cold spots in the corridor outside the man's classroom, making sure his own magic was as quiet as possible in his vicinity. The soul tether was gone. The piece of Voldemort that had been lodged against him for the first 6 years of his life was gone. But that didn't mean Voldemort, or Voldemort's shade, or whatever occupied the back of Quirrell's skull, couldn't sense him. The scar on his forehead hadn't hurt since the cleansing. He noted this. He considered what it meant. If the soul fragment has been removed, Hermione said, 3 days before he was supposed to meet Sirius, sitting in their increasingly usual library corner with books spread between them like territory claimed, and you no longer have any dark magic tethered to you, then theoretically you and Voldemort's remnant have no supernatural connection anymore. "But he still created me as a sacrifice point," Harry said. The plan was always to use me against him. Whether that requires the soul fragment or not depends on the specific magical mechanism of the sacrifice, which I don't fully understand yet. I found something, Hermione said. She slid a book across to him, ancient, heavy, the kind of book that libraries kept in the restricted section not because it was dangerous but because it was so old and fragile that unsupervised handling was a concern. Lily Potter's Protection. What she did when she died. Harry looked at the page she had marked. It was a theory of sacrificial magic, old, pre-ministry, the kind of magical ethics writing that didn't exist anymore because nobody wrote about magic this way anymore, as though it had a moral dimension that needed philosophical examination rather than simply a technical one. The relevant passage was marked in Hermione's pencil. She used pencil in old books, always, which Harry found both practical and considerate. Wherein the sacrifice is made freely, with full awareness, from love rather than compulsion, the protection thus created is not merely a ward but a living magic, it inheres in the object of the sacrifice's love rather than in any external structure. The protection is, in the technical sense, the mother-made magic. It cannot be cast against. It cannot be broken from outside. It can only fade when the object of the sacrifice's love is deliberately returned to a circumstance of deliberate unloving. Harry read the passage twice. The Dursleys, he said. They didn't love you, Hermione said quietly. They resented you. And the protection was supposed to be renewed by being in a place of love. By being with people who loved you. She looked at him. But you were never with people who loved you. Dumbledore sent me there anyway, Harry said. Because the blood protection was useful for the ward structure. Even if the emotional component, he stopped. The implications were spreading out in front of him like a board position, and like a board position, once you saw it you couldn't unsee it. He needed me at Privet Drive for the ward structure. The blood connection to my mother through Petunia. The killing curse protection inhering in me as a ward anchor. He looked at Hermione. That's the soul tether logic. It's the same structure. Use me as a magical object rather than a person and the protection persists. But the protection against Voldemort specifically, Hermione said slowly, it's in you. Your mother put it in you. Not as a ward on a location but as a quality of your magic. Can it be weaponized? Harry said. She was quiet for a long moment, reading. I don't know, she said. The text doesn't go there directly. But the implication is that whatever Voldemort tried to do to you in 1981, it rebounded because of the protection, and the protection is love magic, which is the opposite of how he thinks. He can't, she frowned. He can't account for it. It's outside his framework. Harry sat with that. He thought about Quirrell and the cold in the corridor and the turban and a shade of a man who had killed his parents looking for a way back to a body, a proper body, while the real structural problem with Voldemort, the Horcruxes, the soul anchors, sat behind a locked door on the third floor being guarded by a chess set and some devil's snare and whatever else Dumbledore had arranged. He's going to try for the thing on the third floor, Harry said. The Philosopher's Stone, Hermione said quietly. I think that's what it is. I found a reference. Nicholas Flamel. Dumbledore worked with him and, the stone creates the elixir of life, Harry said. A proper body. Not just a host. He looked at her. When? I don't know. But if Voldemort's been at this school all term, in Quirrell, she looked up. The protections on the stone. They're laid by professors. Dumbledore's involved. But what if Dumbledore's away? What if something draws him away and Quirrell makes a move? He arranges it, Harry said. Or it's arranged for him. They looked at each other. Saturday, Harry said. I meet Sirius Saturday. We bring this to him and Ragnarok. He looked at her steadily. And we don't do anything alone before then. Agreed, Hermione said, and meant it, and closed the book with careful reverence. Outside the library windows, the Scottish sky was doing what it did in November, grey and low and entirely committed to being exactly that grey, exactly that low, as far as the eye could see. Inside, the library was warm and lamplit and full of the smell of old paper, and Harry and Hermione sat across from each other with books between them and something complicated and enormous in the air, and it was, Harry thought, exactly the right place to be thinking about it. Not alone. Not without preparation. Not as someone else's instrument. On his own terms, with his own people, facing the right direction. The compass needle was pointing true north. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. The Saturday meeting with Sirius didn't happen the way Harry planned. It was a Friday night when Hermione found him in the corridor outside the library at 10:30, which was past curfew, which told him immediately that something had moved faster than either of them expected. She was breathing hard and her hair was worse than usual, and she had a book under one arm and the look of someone who had been trying to decide whether to come and find him and had only just resolved the argument with herself. "He's going to move tonight," she said. Harry looked at her. "You're certain?" "Quirrell didn't eat dinner. He went to his office after afternoon classes and he hasn't come out. I asked nearly headless Nick to keep an eye and she stopped." "Harry, the cold in the corridor. It's different tonight." "It's directed," Harry said. He'd felt it too, actually, had been sitting in his room for the past hour with the uncomfortable awareness that something in the school's magical frequency had shifted, had put it down to proximity to something he'd been too tired to examine and now understood hadn't been tiredness at all. He'd been dampened. Briefly. Someone, had applied pressure to the edges of his awareness. Which meant Voldemort knew he'd been paying attention. Harry stood very still for a moment and thought about options at approximately the speed of someone whose entire thinking apparatus had just been told there was no more time for thinking. "Get McGonagall," he said. "She's not in her office. I checked on the way, she'll be in her classroom this time of night, she always works late on Fridays. Transfiguration classroom, 2nd floor." He looked at her. "Go. Tell her everything. Tell her about Quirrell and Albania and the turban and tonight, all of it. If she doesn't believe you, tell her to look in Quirrell's office for evidence of dark magic and ask herself why the cold spot in her school's magical frequency has been moving for the past 2 months." Hermione absorbed this in one breath. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure he doesn't get through the door before McGonagall can get there." "Harry, Hermione. McGonagall. Now." She went. Harry turned and walked toward the 3rd-floor corridor, which was not the action of a sensible person and was absolutely the action of someone who understood that the difference between everything being manageable and everything being catastrophic was often a matter of about 15 minutes. The corridor was cold. Not the ambient Hogwarts in November cold, but the specific wrongness Harry had been mapping for 2 months, amplified now to a point where it was almost physical, a pressure against his skin, a narrowing of the air. The torches were lower than they should have been, not extinguished but suppressed, their light thick and orange and minimal. The door at the end was open. Harry stopped. He'd expected to find Quirrell still working on it. The protections on the stone were substantial, 7 layers according to what Hermione had assembled from the fragments of information scattered through the library's records, and nobody moved through 7 layers of protective magic quickly regardless of what they were carrying in their turban. But the door was open. He stepped through into the first chamber. Devil's Snare, which had been neutralized, the plant was contracted against the walls, not dead but withdrawn, the way it went in the presence of sufficient light. Quirrell had conjured fire, Harry guessed, or had a light source powerful enough to drive it back. Harry moved through quickly. The plant made a sound like breathing as he passed. The second chamber, the winged keys. The right one was already in the lock on the far door. The swarm of keys was in agitated motion overhead, metallic and frantic, disturbed by recent passage. Harry opened the door and went through. The chess set. This was where he stopped, because the chess set hadn't been simply moved aside, it had been destroyed. The giant pieces were scattered, some intact, some shattered, across the board and the surrounding floor, and it had been done with magic, raw and forceful and not careful, and the doing of it had left a residue in the air that made Harry's teeth ache. Not Quirrell's magic. Quirrell was methodical, controlled, the careful hesitance of a man managing a presence in his skull that used his hands but didn't quite use them right. This was different. This was Voldemort losing patience. Harry moved through the chess chamber and the troll corridor. The troll was unconscious, not dead, collapsed against the wall with a precise neatness that didn't match the chaos of the chess room and suggested two different approaches to the same problem, two different minds working, and through the flame door and the potion's logic and came to the final chamber. The mirror of Eriste was there. He hadn't known about the mirror. Hermione's research hadn't extended to it. It stood against the far wall, immense and ornate, with its carved inscription along the top, and in front of it stood Quirrell with his back to Harry, hands pressed to the mirror's frame, and the cold in the room was absolute. Harry stood in the doorway. Quirrell's hands fell from the mirror. He went still. "I wondered," he said, "how long before you found your way here." His voice was different, the stammer was gone, had been shed like a skin, and what was underneath was measured and cold and entirely controlled. Not Quirrell's voice, not exactly. Something wearing Quirrell's voice. The boy who walked into Gringotts and started pulling threads. A pause. "Your mother's son." "In more ways than one," Harry said. Quirrell turned. His face was wrong in a way that went beyond illness or possession, the wrongness of something that had been used as a vessel for a very long time and was beginning to show the cost. His eyes were Quirrell's eyes, but the thing looking through them was not. "You shouldn't be here," Quirrell said. "Not because you're a child, that's irrelevant. Because you are an inconvenience that I have not yet decided how to resolve." "You're trying to get the stone from the mirror," Harry said. He looked at the mirror of Eriste. "You can't see it." A pause. "Clever," the thing behind Quirrell's eyes said. "The protection requires genuine desire without ulterior motive. Flamel's design, not Dumbledore's, rather elegant. I can see myself holding it. Not obtaining it. There's a difference." The eyes moved to Harry. "What do you see?" Harry looked at the mirror. He saw himself. Standing in this room, looking at the mirror, and in his reflected hand was the stone, not using it, not even quite holding it with intent, just having it. Having it and not knowing what to do with it yet, which was different from wanting to use it for anything specific. The stone appeared in his pocket. He felt it arrive, a warmth against his hip that was completely distinct from the ward stone's warmth, something denser and older and humming with a very specific kind of power. He kept his face still. "Well?" Quirrell said. "I see my parents," Harry said. Which was true. They were in the reflection too, standing behind his reflected self. Alive. The thing behind Quirrell's eyes processed this. Interesting. It looked at the mirror for a moment. "You've been busy, Potter. The treaty filing. The Black Trial. Dismantling 2 years of Dumbledore's careful architecture. And still you end up here, in the same room, serving the same essential function." The voice was almost thoughtful. "He always said you were the key to my defeat. He cast 73 spells to keep you pointed in the right direction. And here you stand, pointing at me regardless, because some things are simply structural." "I'm not here because of a prophecy or a design or a destiny," Harry said. "I'm here because my friend came to find me and I knew if I waited someone would die." "And the stone? Is not something you're getting tonight." The cold in the room concentrated. Quirrell's body stiffened, and then the thing controlling it stopped pretending to be Quirrell, the posture changed, the quality of stillness changed, and what was standing in Quirrell's body now was something that Harry had felt before, briefly, in the Soul Tether's last moment, just before Agrak pulled it away. Something very old and very hungry and absolutely without the softening effects of embodied humanity. "Give me the stone," it said. "No," Harry said. It moved. Not Quirrell moving, not the careful deliberate motion of a possessed body. Something faster and less careful, crossing the chamber with a violence of intent that felt like weather, and Harry's magic came up to meet it the way breath came before thought, not a spell, not a specific structured charm, just his core opening fully for the first time in a real crisis and throwing everything it had at the thing coming toward him. The collision was physical. Harry was knocked back 2 steps, felt the cold of Voldemort's presence hit him like diving into deep water, and pushed back with everything his mother had left him, the protection that Hermione had found in the restricted text, the love that lived in his magic like a foundation, not soft at all but utterly unyielding. Quirrell screamed. It was a terrible sound, not pain alone but the sound of a person discovering that the thing sharing their body was being damaged by contact with another person, and the damage was transferring, and there was nothing to be done about the transfer. Quirrell's hands had reached for Harry's arms and were now pulling back with the specific horror of someone who touched something that burned. Harry looked at his own hands. Not burning. Not glowing. Nothing visible at all. But the cold was retreating. "What?" Quirrell gasped, Quirrell, the real Quirrell, briefly present in the gaps of Voldemort's attention turning elsewhere. "What are you?" "It's my mother," Harry said, and he meant it as an explanation but it came out as something else, a statement of fact and grief and gratitude and defiance all at once, aimed not at Quirrell but at the thing inside him. The thing inside him was afraid. Harry could feel it, not see it, not hear it, but feel it the way you felt cold air through a cracked door, the specific quality of something that had calculated everything and had not calculated this. Not his power, not his preparation, not his 2 years of study and the 3 people waiting outside the school ready to act. The fear was of the magic itself. His mother's magic, living in him, which was not something you could plan against because it was not something that operated on the same terms as the things Voldemort understood. He thought about the passage in Hermione's book, "It can only fade when the object of the sacrifice's love is deliberately returned to a circumstance of deliberate unloving." Privet Drive had been trying to undo it for 6 years. 73 spells had been layered over it. And still it was here, in this room, in his hands. Some things were simply structural. "Leave him," Harry said. To the thing in the turban. "Leave him and go. You know you can't take the stone while I'm standing between you and it. And you know," he paused, feeling for the right words, because this mattered. "You know what happens if you keep trying. You felt it." The cold held for a long moment. Then Quirrell's legs went out from under him. The man crumpled to the floor and what left him was not dramatic, no great rushing dark, no visible spectral form. Just a sudden change in the quality of the air, the cold retreating all at once, and the pressure against Harry's awareness lifting so abruptly that the room almost felt warm in the aftermath. Quirrell was unconscious. His face, slack and unguarded, was the face of someone who'd been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just put it down. Harry stood over him for a moment, breathing. Then the chamber door opened and McGonagall came through with Hermione 2 steps behind her and a wand lit to full brightness, and McGonagall took the scene in with the controlled speed of a woman who'd survived a war and was not easily surprised, and still her face did something complicated when she looked from Quirrell to Harry. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No," Harry said. She looked at him, at his hands, his face, the general state of him. Then at Quirrell. Then at the mirror. The stone. Harry reached into his pocket and set it on the floor. McGonagall stared at it. "How did you?" "I think the mirror worked correctly," Harry said. "I got it from the mirror. It's Flamel's design." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up the stone and put it in her own pocket with the decisiveness of someone removing a problem from an equation. She pointed her wand at Quirrell and cast something that sealed him in a containment ward. She looked at Hermione, who was standing in the doorway looking slightly pale but entirely intact. "Miss Granger," she said. "You demonstrated considerable courage in coming to find me." Harry told me to, Hermione said. That speaks well of you both. McGonagall looked around the chamber, the mirror, the unconscious Quirrell, the boy standing in the middle of all of it. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite its opposite. Mr. Potter. Yes, Harry said. The headmaster needs to be informed. Yes, Harry said. I know. And there will be an extensive conversation about what has happened tonight and what precedents it sets for students engaging with McGonagall, Harry said. She stopped. I know, he said. All of it. I know. He met her eyes. But Voldemort just tried to come back and was stopped, and Quirrell needs a healer, and the stone needs to go back to Flammel, and someone should also check whether Dumbledore left the school tonight or whether he was drawn away, because I think it might be the latter. He paused. Can the conversation about precedents happen in the morning? She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned to the doorway and said, with the complete authority of someone who had been managing Hogwarts for 30 years and was not about to stop, both of you. Follow me. Now. Dumbledore came back. He arrived at 2 in the morning, which was either because he'd been alerted to Quirrell's collapse or because he'd felt something through the school's wards, and by the time he walked through the front doors McGonagall had already sent 2 patronuses, one to the DMLE and one to St. Mungo's, and had Harry and Hermione in her office with tea that none of them were really drinking. He stood in McGonagall's office doorway and looked at Harry, and his face was not the managed expression Harry had learned to read. It was something rarer, genuine alarm, and underneath the alarm, something that might have been relief, and underneath that, a recognition that sat uncomfortably. You were drawn away, Harry said. Something at the ministry tonight that turned out to be nothing. Yes, Dumbledore said quietly. He's more capable than you gave him credit for, Harry said. Working through Quirrell from a limited capacity, he managed to get through 6 protections and arrange a ministry emergency simultaneously. He paused. You underestimated him. Yes, Dumbledore said again. I have the stone. McGonagall has the stone. It should go back to Flammel immediately. Keeping it here was a mistake, and keeping it here now that Quirrell has been removed and Voldemort will need a new strategy is a much bigger one. Harry met Dumbledore's eyes. Destroying it is the right move. Flammel will agree, I think he already suspected as much. Dumbledore looked at him. The recognition had settled into something that was trying very hard to be its own thing and not something borrowed from the past, not the grief of looking at James Potter's eyes and Lily Potter's face, but something present tense, looking at who was actually there. When did you, the Horcrux research, Harry said. Ragnarok's team has been working on it since October. We have a list of probable locations for 4 others. I wanted to have more before bringing it to you, but tonight changes the timeline. McGonagall made a sharp sound that was not quite a word. Dumbledore stepped into the office and sat down in the chair across from Harry, and in the lamplight he looked, for the first time Harry had seen, genuinely old. Not the venerable ancient authority of his public persona, but a person who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and had just discovered it was heavier than he'd calculated. 4, he said. Probable 4, Harry said. Possibly more. We're still working the research. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. I want to do this together. Not because I can't pursue it without you, I can, and I was planning to, but because it goes faster with both of us, and speed matters now. You trust me to work with you on this? Dumbledore said. And it was not a rhetorical question, he meant it, genuinely uncertain. I trust your capabilities and your knowledge, Harry said. I trust your intelligence. I don't fully trust your judgment about what I'm allowed to know or what risks are acceptable to take with my life, and I don't think I'll fully trust those things for a while. He paused. But working together doesn't require full trust. It requires shared information and agreed terms. And those terms? Equal access to the Horcrux research. You don't pursue leads without telling me. I don't pursue leads without telling you. All information about the prophecy and any other relevant intelligence is shared in full, immediately. He looked at him. And you stop making decisions about my life and safety without my input. Not recommendations, decisions. Completely. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. Harry waited. Agreed, Dumbledore said. The morning brought Shacklebolt, who arrived at 7 sharp with the contained urgency of someone who had been woken by a Patronus and had been moving efficiently since. Behind him came Sirius, who had apparently apparat to the Hogsmeade village boundary the moment Shacklebolt's owl had reached him and had walked the rest of the way in the dark, because he was Sirius, and Sirius's response to Harry being in danger was always to be physically present as fast as possible regardless of whether physical presence was the most logical intervention. He walked into McGonagall's office. McGonagall had at some point acquired coffee and the resigned bearing of someone who had accepted that her office was now a command center, and looked at Harry from the doorway with an expression Harry had to look at quickly and then look away from because it was too unguarded to examine for long. "You're fine," Sirius said. "I'm fine," Harry confirmed. "Right." Sirius sat down, accepted the coffee McGonagall handed him without looking at it, and looked at Harry again. "Tell me everything." Harry told him everything. By the time he finished, Sirius had gone through the coffee and the unguarded expression had been replaced by the thinking expression, which was different, sharper, leaning forward, the expression of a man who had spent 6 years with nothing to do but think about things and had come out of it with a mind that could move through a problem quickly and without the hesitations that came from never having tested yourself. "The other Horcruxes," he said. "Ragnarok's list." "What's on it?" "A locket that belonged to Salazar Slytherin," Harry said. "We think it's with Regulus's things." He paused, watching Sirius's face. "Your brother. Ragnarok thinks Regulus found out what Voldemort was doing and tried to destroy one himself. There's evidence in the Black family vault, a letter Regulus left. We haven't accessed the Black Vault yet because the estate was still in legal limbo until your exoneration cleared." Sirius had gone very still. "Reg," he said quietly. "Not a question. A breath." "He was trying to stop it," Harry said. "By himself. Without telling anyone." Sirius stared at the coffee in his hands for a moment. Then he looked up, and the grief was there and was real and Harry let it be there without trying to manage it. "All right," Sirius said eventually. "We access the vault. I'll authorize it." "There's also a diary," Harry said. "Voldemort's. Made when he was young, from what we can tell. That one worries me more in the short term because the locket is contained and isolated, but a diary can be given to someone, used on someone. We don't know where it is." "Lucius Malfoy," Shacklebolt said. Everyone looked at him. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and the methodical expression he wore when he'd been running something to ground. "I've been running a parallel inquiry on known Death Eater possession of unusual magical objects since the treaty filing gave me grounds to request asset records. Lucius Malfoy's holdings include an item listed as a quote, personal journal of significant magical value, unquote, which he declared for exemption from confiscation in 1981 on the grounds that it was a family heirloom." He looked at Harry. "It's not a family heirloom. No journal of that description appears in the Malfoy estate records before 1981. We need it," Harry said. "Getting it legally is," Shacklebolt paused. "Complicated. He's a Wisengamot member. He has lawyers. And Malfoy's been careful to keep his hands clean enough that nothing we have on the Horcrux research creates specific grounds for a warrant yet." Harry thought about Narcissa. About grey robes and a tea room in Diagon Alley and an almost smile that was small and real. "Leave Lucius Malfoy to me," he said. Sirius gave him a look. "Harry, not a confrontation," Harry said. "I have a resource." He met Sirius's eyes. "I told you I'd let you know when I needed you to trust me." Sirius held his gaze for a moment. "Fine," he said. "But I'm the one who talks to Narcissa with you." That's fair, Harry said. Dumbledore addressed the school at breakfast that morning. He was careful about what he said. Quirrell had been taken ill, was receiving care, would not be returning for the remainder of the year. The third-floor corridor was now completely off-limits. He said nothing about the stone and nothing about what had happened the night before, and Harry watched the faces of the students around him process this and understood why Dumbledore had phrased it this way. But the story would come out. These things always did. He ate his breakfast and thought about Horcrux locations and the Malfoy diary and the coming Wisengamot proceedings, and across the table Hermione was reading and Ron was reconstructing the night in retrograde, working backward from what Harry had told him to the moments that would have required what decisions, the way he reconstructed chess games to learn from them. He was afraid of you, Ron said. Actually afraid. Of my mother's protection, Harry said. Same thing, isn't it? Ron said. Harry thought about that. Thought about what it meant for the thing to be in him, not a curse, not a weapon, not a soul fragment someone else had lodged there, but something that was genuinely his. Inherited, not imposed. Maybe, he said. Draco appeared at the end of the Gryffindor table, standing at a slight distance with the body language of someone who wanted to approach and was calibrating whether it was advisable. Harry looked at him. Draco came and sat on the end of the bench. Something happened last night, he said quietly. Yes, Harry said. Draco looked at him with the directness he'd had on the train, the unperformed version. My father sent me a letter this morning. He wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual. He paused. I didn't see anything unusual. That's an interesting choice of phrasing, Harry said. Draco shrugged with one shoulder, which was Draco for I'm being deliberate and I'd prefer you to notice. My mother told me that what I observe and what I report are different categories and I should think carefully about both. He looked at the table. She also told me, last week, that I should be careful about what my father asks me to do at school this year. Harry studied him. She's been talking to you a lot. More than usual, Draco said. He was quiet for a moment. Is she involved in something? With you? She's been helpful, Harry said carefully. She gave me information that was useful. That's her choice to have made and I'm not going to characterize it beyond that. Draco nodded slowly. He looked like someone doing complicated emotional arithmetic, loyalty to a parent on one side, a dawning picture of what that parent was on the other, and the difficult space between them where he had to eventually stand. Harry recognized the arithmetic. When you go after Voldemort, Draco said. Very quietly. The Horcruxes. My father has one. Harry went still. I heard him talking, Draco said. He didn't look up from the table. At home. Over the summer. He was talking to someone through the flu and he said it needed to remain protected until the master's return. He said the journal was the safest method. He paused. I didn't know what it meant then. Ron was very carefully not looking at this conversation. Hermione had stopped reading. Draco, Harry said. Draco looked up. What you just told me, Harry said, could be considered disloyal to your father. I know, Draco said. So why did you tell me? Draco looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes that were his mother's eyes in terms of what lived behind them, the intelligence, the evaluation, the particular quality of someone who was choosing precisely how much to say. Because my mother chose a side, he said. And I'd rather choose mine before I'm standing on the wrong one and it's too late to move. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then, thank you, he said. Draco nodded once and stood up and went back to the Slytherin table, and Harry watched him go and thought about all the ways that people got trapped in architectures they hadn't chosen and what it cost them to climb out. The letter to Narcissa went through Ragnarok. The reply came back in 2 days, and it was brief and elegant and said, in the specific language of someone who understood exactly what was being asked and had already thought about whether to provide it, that she could arrange access to the journal by way of an inventory discrepancy in the Malfoy family vault that would require formal Gringotts arbitration to resolve, during which time all disputed items would need to be held in Gringotts custody pending review. Harry read it and had the specific feeling he sometimes got when a chess move solved 3 problems simultaneously. "She's going to arrange for Gringotts to seize it legally," he said. "From under Lucius's nose," Sirius said. He looked at the letter with an expression of reluctant appreciation. "Narcissa Malfoy is terrifying. She's good at navigating her constraints," Harry said. "She married Lucius," Sirius said. "Of her own volition. People do things when they're young that they spend a long time trying to navigate the consequences of," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. Then he looked away. "Yes," he said. "They do." The arbitration happened 3 weeks later. The diary was in Gringotts custody by the end of it, held in a magically sealed vault while Ragnarok's Cursebreakers confirmed its nature. They confirmed it in 48 hours, a Horcrux, definitely, old and powerful and angry in the way that objects containing soul fragments were angry, which was to say not like an emotion but like a weather system. Destroying it required a basilisk fang, which was its own problem, until one of Ragnarok's senior Cursebreakers mentioned almost in passing that there were basilisk remains in the Department of Mysteries which had been confiscated in 1962 and never disposed of, and Shacklebolt, with the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe his own luck, quietly arranged access through a contact in the unspeakables. The diary was destroyed on a Thursday afternoon, 3 months into the new year, in a secure Gringotts chamber with Harry present at his own insistence, and the destruction was not dramatic, a moment of violent darkness and then nothing. Just an ordinary notebook with a hole through it and the particular silence of something that had been loudly wrong being suddenly absent. "2 down," Ragnarok said. "The locket next," Harry said. The Wisengamot proceedings against Dumbledore were formally opened 4 months into Harry's second Hogwarts term, when Harry was not quite 10, having been built on the foundation of the Treaty Council filing and the financial audit and the full index documentation of 73 spells that Ragnarok had been expanding and refining for 2 years. Harry didn't testify in person at the initial hearing. His written statement was entered instead, 40 pages, written over 3 weeks, precise and specific and completely unemotional in the same way that a list of 73 spells with dates and classifications and effects was unemotional. Not because the emotions weren't there. Because the facts were sufficient. The Wisengamot was not unanimous. Nothing involving Dumbledore was ever going to produce a simple majority, let alone a clean consensus, because he had 6 decades of institutional relationships and genuine regard and genuine good works in the same record as the 73 spells. What happened instead was a fractured, complicated, months-long process that resulted in no dramatic conviction but produced, in its grinding way, something arguably more durable. Formal removal from the position of Chief Warlock. A sanction for the illegal use of enchantments, with specific remediation requirements. A mandatory independent oversight review of Hogwarts governance. A formal acknowledgement, the first in the history of the Wisengamot, entered into permanent record, that the magical manipulation of a minor for strategic purposes, regardless of the strategic stakes, was a crime and would be prosecuted as such from that point forward. Not everything. Not a cell, not a broken staff. Not the dramatic ending of something that had been so large and so long. But a line drawn, in ink that wouldn't wash out, in the permanent record. Harry read the final determination in his study at Hogwarts, with Ragnarok's summary letter clipped to the front and Sirius's Messier handwritten note tucked into the margin that said simply, "It's not enough and it's also not nothing. Both of those things are true. I love you, kid." Harry sat with that for a while. Then he set it down and picked up the research file on the third Horcrux. Dumbledore came to find him that evening, which Harry had expected. The headmaster knocked on the study door, which was a first for a person who owned the building, and came in and sat in the chair across the desk and looked at Harry with the expression he'd been wearing since the night of the Philosopher's Stone, the present tense one. "I've been removed from the Wisengamot," he said. "I know," Harry said. I read the summary. I want you to know, he paused. I am not, another pause, longer. I find that I am less certain, in my old age, about the quality of my own feelings than I was at any earlier point in my life. I thought I was certain. I was always certain. It was, he looked at his hands. Rather comfortable, actually. Certainty. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore looked up at him. What made you certain, he said. That what you were doing was right. Starting this. At 6 years old, sitting in a goblin's diagnostic chair. Harry thought about that question seriously, the way the question deserved. I wasn't certain it was right, he said. I was certain it was true. There's a difference. The spells were real. The documents were real. Sirius's missing trial was real. I didn't have to be certain about what was right, I just had to follow what was real and let it go where it went. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. James would have been furious at me, he said. Lily would have, he stopped. Lily would have been colder about it. Which was always worse. I've heard that about her, Harry said. You have her quality, Dumbledore said. Of following the real thing. Of not being distracted by the comfortable explanation. He paused. I would like to continue working together. On the Horcruxes. On what comes next. He met Harry's eyes. Under your terms. They haven't changed, Harry said. No, Dumbledore said. I didn't expect them to. He stood. He paused at the door. Harry. The prophecy. He turned. The full prophecy, which I have never told you completely. I would like to do that tonight, if you're willing. Not as a strategy or a preparation. Just because you're entitled to know the full thing and I should have told you before now. Harry leaned back. Outside his window the highland view was full dark, stars scattered in their thousands above the mountains, the sky doing what it did when it was clear and cold and entirely itself. All right, Harry said. Tell me. Dumbledore told him. It was the full prophecy, every word, and when it was finished Harry sat with it in the same way he'd sat with everything, turning it over, finding its edges, understanding its shape. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born as the 7th month dies. Marked as his equal. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Harry was quiet for a long time. It doesn't mean what you thought it meant, he said finally. No, Dumbledore said. Or rather, it means several things, and you chose one interpretation, and built a lot of architecture around that one interpretation. Harry looked at him. Neither can live while the other survives. That's not a mandate for me to sacrifice myself. It's a statement about the nature of the conflict. As long as Voldemort has Horcruxes, he can't truly die. And the love protection, my mother's protection, makes me the only person who can stand between him and what he wants to do without being destroyed by him. He paused. It's not saying I have to die. It's saying I have to be willing to. Dumbledore was very still. Yes, he said, very quietly. That is, yes. And I am, Harry said. Willing. Not because a prophecy says so but because there are people I love and things worth protecting, and I've been learning what I need to know, and I'm not done yet but I'm getting there. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. And when the time comes, I'll be ready. On my own terms. Something in Dumbledore's face moved, and whatever it was had enough in it that he didn't try to respond to it in words. He nodded once, and left. Harry sat alone in his study for a while after that, listening to the castle settle around him, the creaks and sighs of a very old building, the distant sound of students in the corridors heading to dinner, Peeves creating some minor catastrophe 2 floors up, the general warm living noise of a place that was, he'd realized gradually and then suddenly, home. His home. His, with nobody else's claim on it. He picked up the Horcrux file and turned to the page on the locket. 3 down, 4 to find. Voldemort's still out there, without a body, rebuilding, planning his return with the particular patience of someone who decided that patience was just another form of violence applied over time. The Wizengamot proceeding still unfinished in the ways that mattered. Draco navigating the space between his father's world and something he was trying to understand. Narcissa in her grey robes playing the longest game Harry had ever seen anyone play. Ron getting better at seeing the whole board. Hermione already ahead of all of them on 3 different research tracks and keeping notes in pencil in old books with the specific courtesy of someone who understood that knowledge was communal. Sirius, alive. Out of Azkaban. In a house in Hogsmeade that smelled of lived-in wood and had no cupboard under the stairs. Ragnarok, who had looked at 73 spells on a 6-year-old and had said, "I do not operate that way." Harry looked at the ward stone on his desk. Still warm, always warm, the continuous record of his location and status. He picked it up and held it for a moment the way you held something that had been important long enough to become familiar. Then he set it back down and opened the file. There was work to do. Not because a prophecy said so. Not because someone's architecture had designated him the instrument. Not because a bent compass needle had been pointed at this and left. Because he'd looked at the real things, the spells, the documents, the missing trial, the people in the mirror, and followed them to where they led. Because Sirius had taught him to fly in a field outside Hogsmeade and Hermione kept notes in pencil and Ron could see the whole board. Because Lily Potter had walked into the path of a killing curse and put something in him that didn't have a name except the obvious one. Because Ragnarok had inclined his head across a diagnostic table and Harry had inclined his back. Because he was Harry. Not the chosen one. Not the boy who lived. Not Dumbledore's instrument or Voldemort's nemesis or the sum of anyone else's design. Just Harry, with his parents' magic in his blood and his own mind finally pointed at true north, reading a file by lamplight in a castle in Scotland while somewhere above him the stars did what stars did, steady and indifferent and entirely, absolutely real. He turned to the first page. He started reading.